Hello guys, welcome to Eldritch Potter. Today we have an incredible story for you. Gringotts' blood ritual at age 9 revealed Dumbledore placed 7 killing curses on Harry and stole his lordships. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Bled. True, the thing about Gringotts was that it smelled like metal and old decisions. Harry Potter had walked past it 3 times already, hands shoved into the pockets of Dudley's cast-off jeans, which were approximately 4 sizes too large and held up by a length of garden twine. He'd been in Diagon Alley by accident, really, or something that felt like accident, though some part of him, the part that made strange things happen when he was frightened or angry, had been pulling him toward this particular street since he'd woken up that morning with no particular reason to be anywhere. He was 9 years old. He had a fading bruise on his left forearm from where Vernon had grabbed him 2 days ago, and he had £11 and 40 pence in his pocket from a combination of odd jobs for the neighbors that Aunt Petunia didn't know about, and he had, for the first time in recent memory, an entire Saturday with no chores assigned and no one watching. He'd found the leaky cauldron by following a man in a lime green bowler hat. He'd gotten into Diagon Alley by watching an old woman tap the bricks in a specific pattern and then copying her when no one was looking. He'd spent 20 minutes just walking up and down the cobblestones with his mouth slightly open, taking in the color and the noise and the impossible shop fronts, the jars of things that moved, the robes in 17 shades, the children pulling at their parents' sleeves. He hadn't felt afraid. That was the strange part. He probably should have. Strange place, no adults who knew him, no money worth mentioning, but instead he'd felt the specific sensation of a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was on him. And then Gringotts, white and gleaming at the far end of the alley, and that pulling sensation again, stronger. He walked up the marble steps on his third pass. The goblin guards watched him with expressions like carved stone given a thin coat of contempt, but neither of them moved to stop him, and Harry had learned a long time ago that if you walked like you were supposed to be somewhere, most people didn't question you. Inside was vast and echoey and smelled even more strongly of metal, copper and iron, and something older than both. Goblins behind the long counter moved with the quick precision of people who had no patience for inefficiency, and the noise was a specific kind of controlled chaos, transactions and murmured figures and the rustle of parchment and the distant sound of something mechanical deep below. Harry stood in the entrance for a moment, just getting his bearings, and then a goblin about 4 feet from the end of the nearest counter looked directly at him with eyes that were the particular yellow of old parchment. "Lost, are you?" The goblin's voice was dry as chalk dust. "No," Harry said. "I don't think so." The goblin tilted his head, and something shifted in his expression, not warmth, exactly, but a kind of sharpened attention. "You don't think so?" An unusual answer. "It's the honest one." A pause. The goblin set down the quill he'd been holding. "State your business." "I don't know exactly," Harry said, which was also honest. "I think I have an account here. My name is Harry Potter." The quality of the silence that followed was remarkable. It moved through the immediate area like a ripple through still water, a micropause in the scratching of quills, a fractional stillness in the movement of the goblins nearest to them. The yellow-eyed goblin didn't blink. "Harry Potter," he repeated. "Yes. Do you have identification?" Harry almost laughed. "I'm 9. I live in a cupboard. I don't have identification." Another one of those pauses. Then the goblin said, "Wait here," in a tone that suggested this was not a request, and moved along the counter to speak in a low, rapid clip to 2 other goblins. There was a brief, pointed exchange, a glance in Harry's direction, and then the yellow-eyed goblin came back. "I am Grip Hook," he said. "Come with me." They went through a door behind the counters and into a corridor that was smaller and quieter, lit by the same greenish-gold lamps as the main hall. Grip Hook walked quickly, and Harry kept up without effort. Years of being sent to fetch things in a hurry had given him a particular quality of efficient movement. "Where are we going?" Harry asked. "To verify your identity properly," Grip Hook said. "If you are who you say you are, we will require a blood verification." A small cut, nothing to worry about. I'm not worried, Harry said. Griphook glanced back at him. Most children your age are frightened of Gringotts. Most children my age haven't found it on their own. Harry paused. Also, I'm not most children. The goblin made a sound that might, in another species, have been a laugh. The room they ended up in was small and circular, with walls of dark stone and a single table in the center, black wood, very old, with symbols carved along its edge that Harry couldn't read but felt an odd resonance with, like a word he'd forgotten and was on the verge of remembering. There were 2 chairs, both sized for humans, and a third object on the table, a shallow bowl, also black, with runes etched around the rim. A second goblin was already in the room. This one was older than Griphook, with deep lines in his gray face and hands that were remarkably still, the hands of someone who had learned to stop fidgeting sometime in the last several centuries. He wore robes that were considerably finer than Griphook's, and he looked at Harry with an expression that was entirely unreadable. Sit, Griphook said, and Harry sat. This, Griphook said, gesturing to the older goblin, is Sharpclaw. He is our senior heritage specialist. He will conduct the blood verification. Sharpclaw nodded once. He had a voice like gravel being rolled around in a barrel when he spoke. You understand what this is, boy? A blood verification. Griphook said. A heritage ritual, Sharpclaw corrected. The blood verification is a component of it, but what we perform here is more comprehensive. Your blood will speak to the bowl, and the bowl will speak to us. It will show your lineage, your inheritance claims, your magical bonds, all of them. He paused, and something moved behind his eyes. All of them. Harry looked at the bowl. All right. You consent? Yes. Sharpclaw produced a small knife, wickedly sharp, the blade barely 3 centimeters long, and held it out handle first. 3 drops. Center of the bowl. Harry took the knife, pressed it quickly to the pad of his index finger, and let 3 drops of blood fall into the bowl's center. There was no hesitation in him, no flinching. Pain was a thing he was deeply familiar with and had no particular relationship to anymore. It happened, and then it didn't, and you got on with things. The drops hit the bottom of the bowl and spread, and that was when everything became strange. The blood didn't pool. It moved, deliberately, like something with intention, spreading outward in patterns that Harry recognized after a moment as words, runes, the same kind of symbols carved into the table's edge. They glowed faintly gold at first, warm and steady, and Sharpclaw leaned forward with an expression of careful professional attention. Then the color changed. The gold spread and deepened into something richer, and lines began to appear, a family tree, Harry realized, branching and complex, and the names came in order of immediacy, the nearest blood first. James Potter. Lily Potter née Evans. And above them, branching back, generations of Potters stretching further than Harry could follow, and beside the Potters another branch, older and stranger, that bore the name Peveril in letters that were larger than the rest, and beside even that, faint but undeniable, a third branch that made Sharpclaw go very still. Black, the goblin said quietly. He wasn't talking to Harry. An adoption bond. Not formal, conditional. Sirius Black's named heir. He was quiet for a moment, watching the bowl. The Black family magic accepted it. Harry watched too, saying nothing, because he could tell that the ritual wasn't finished. The glow shifted again, and this was when Griphook, who had been standing near the door, made a sharp sound and crossed to the table with quick steps. The gold was still there, but around the edges of it now, bleeding inward, there was something else, black, not the deep and dignified black of the Black family name but a flat, dead black, the color of things that had been deliberately unmade. It moved in 7 distinct threads, each one anchored to a different point in the diagram, and each one was visibly eating at the gold where it touched. Sharpclaw's expression had gone to stone. What is that? Harry asked. The goblin didn't answer immediately. His eyes were moving rapidly across the bowl, reading things Harry couldn't follow, and his jaw was tight with something that Harry, with his particular and hard-won instinct for other people's emotional states, identified not as surprise but as confirmation of a fear that had apparently been long held. "Those," Sharpclaw said, "are bindings." "Bindings on what?" "On you." Sharpclaw looked up from the bowl. "On your magic, your inheritance, your legal personhood under wizarding law. 7 of them, each anchored to a specific component of your birthright." He paused, and when he continued his voice had the particular deliberateness of someone choosing each word for maximum accuracy. "The first 3 are inheritance suppressors. They prevent you from receiving or exercising the lordships that are legally yours. The next 2 are financial redirectors. They have been rerouting income from your family vaults to another destination since shortly after your parents died. The 6th is a core suppressor. It limits the expression of your innate magical ability to a fraction of its true capacity." He paused again, longer this time. "The 7th is the most serious." Harry waited. "It is a variant of the killing curse," Sharpclaw said. "Layered and dormant, not intended to kill immediately, but structured to drain your magical core, your life force, both being slowly consumed. Over years, not hours." He held Harry's gaze steadily. "At the rate of consumption we can calculate from the binding's age and depth, you would not have survived to your mid-20s. The room was very quiet. Harry thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He thought about the way his scar ached on certain nights. He thought about the sensation he'd had for as long as he could remember of being slightly less than he was supposed to be, like a radio tuned to a frequency it couldn't quite reach, the signal always almost there, always just out of resolution. 7, he said. "Yes. Who put them there?" Sharpclaw's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness answered the question before his words did. "The ritual has recorded the magical signature of each binding. They all bear the same signature." He looked at Harry steadily. "Albus Dumbledore." The name settled into the room like a stone into water, and Harry sat with it, and said nothing for a while, and found, to his own mild surprise, that he wasn't shocked. He was angry, a very clean, very cold anger, nothing like the hot embarrassing anger he felt at the Dursleys, which always made him feel small. This was different. This was the anger of looking at a puzzle you'd been struggling with for years and suddenly understanding that someone had hidden half the pieces. "Can they be removed?" he asked. "Yes." Grip Hook, from across the table, in a tone that suggested he very much wanted them to be. "It is not a simple process, and it will require your formal authorization, but yes. All 7 can be dismantled. The killing curse variants will require specific ritual counterwork, but our heritage healers are equipped." "And the lordships? The vaults?" Sharpclaw leaned back slightly. "The lordships can be formally reclaimed through a combination of the blood verification we have just conducted and a presentation before the Wizengamot. They were never legally stripped from you, they were merely suppressed and effectively hidden, which is a critical distinction. You have a claim." A pause. 3 claims, in fact. Potter, Peveril, and Black, the last pending Lord Black's legal status, which is currently, Sirius Black is in Azkaban, Harry said. "Yes. He's innocent," Harry said. He said it the same way he'd said everything else in this room, without drama, without the need for anyone to believe him, just as a statement of fact he happened to be in possession of. "My father's other friend betrayed them. Peter Pettigrew. Sirius never got a trial." The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence from the ones before. Grip Hook and Sharpclaw exchanged a look that carried the weight of a full conversation. "That is a significant claim," Grip Hook said carefully. "It's a true one." Harry looked at the bowl, where the 7 black threads were still visibly eating at his golden lines. "Can we start with removing the bindings? I'd like my magic back first, and then we can talk about everything else." Sharpclaw studied him for a long moment with those ancient, unreadable eyes. Then he said, "You are a very unusual 9-year-old, Lord Potter." "Am I a Lord Potter?" While the binding is still on. Legally, in the sight of goblin law and magical heritage, you have always been Lord Potter. The binding could suppress it. It could not erase it. He paused. Goblin law has always known who you are. We were waiting for you to find us. Then yes, Harry said. I'm a very unusual Lord Potter. Can we get started? The removal process took most of the afternoon. They moved to a different room, larger, with a proper ritual circle inlaid in the floor in silver and iron, and 5 goblins instead of 2, and a quality of contained magical energy that Harry could feel against his skin like standing near a fire. He was asked to stand in the center, and he stood, and they explained what each stage would feel like, and he listened, and when they began, it turned out they had been entirely accurate in their descriptions. The first 3, the inheritance suppressors, came off like plaster from a wound. There was a tug, a sharp sting, and then a sensation of air on something that hadn't had air on it in a very long time. His head cleared slightly with each one, the world coming into slightly sharper focus, like someone turning the resolution up on a television screen. The financial redirectors were different, a pulling sensation, deep in his chest, followed by a sound he felt more than heard, a low resonant tone like a very large bell. When the second one went, he saw, without quite knowing how he was seeing it, the shape of his family's wealth, not the numbers, but the weight of it, the age of it, the centuries of Potter magic and Peveril legacy and black inheritance that had been quietly drained away, and his anger went a degree colder. The core suppressor was the one that took the longest. Sharpclaw worked on it personally, and it took nearly 2 hours, a combination of 4 different goblin healers and a ritual that required them to essentially excavate around the binding before they could remove it without damaging the core beneath. Harry felt it in stages, first a pressure he hadn't known was constant because it had always been there, then a release, incremental, each layer peeling back, and with each layer his magic, his actual magic, not the thin trickle he'd always thought was the whole of it, expanded. By the time the last layer of the core suppressor came free, Harry was sitting in the center of the ritual circle with his hands flat on the floor and his eyes closed, because there was simply a great deal to process. The magic in him wasn't quiet anymore. It was enormous and warm and very present, like a limb he'd thought he'd lost returning with full sensation, and he had to actively concentrate on keeping it contained and calm. One of the younger goblin healers said something in gobbledygook, and there was a chorus of responses. What did he say? Harry asked, without opening his eyes. He said, Sharpclaw replied, with a particular dryness, that your magical core reads as Archon level. Which is a classification we use for perhaps one wizard in every 3 generations. Harry opened his eyes. Is that a problem? Not for us, Griphook said. The 7th binding, the Killing Curse variant, was last, and the room had been quietly reconfigured while the core suppressor was being removed. Additional wards on the outer walls, a second circle within the first, and all 5 goblin healers plus 2 others who had been called in, making 7 in total. Sharpclaw explained at once, precisely, the binding had been keyed to Harry's core, designed to look like natural magical burnout if it was ever detected, the consumption slow enough to be attributable to illness or lack of magical development. It had been running for approximately 6 years. Since Harry was 3, or very nearly. He put it on me when I was 3, Harry said. The signature suggests it was placed in stages. The first layer when you were approximately 18 months old. Subsequent layers added over the following 18 months. Sharpclaw's voice was very even. You were not yet walking properly when the first layer was placed. Harry said nothing. There wasn't anything to say to that. He filed it away in the part of his mind where he put things that needed to be returned to later, with proper attention and a plan, rather than dealt with immediately through emotion, which would be satisfying but inefficient. The removal of the 7th binding hurt. He'd been told it would, and he'd said that was fine, and it was fine in the sense that he endured it without making a sound and without losing consciousness, which seemed to be the metrics the healers were using to determine if it was going acceptably. It lasted about 20 minutes. The Killing Curse variant unwound in fragments rather than a single piece, each fragment requiring individual attention, and each one that came away left behind something that felt like a bruise on his actual life force, a soreness that went deeper than physical. When the last fragment came free, the ritual circle flared, not dramatically, not explosively, but with a deep, sustained pulse of golden light that emanated from Harry outward to the circle's edge and held for a full 3 seconds before fading. All 7 goblin healers stood in silence. Harry stood up, and he was slightly unsteady for a moment, just a moment, and then he wasn't. He felt like himself, except that he had never felt like himself before, so this was actually the first time he was feeling what himself felt like, and it was remarkable. Full and warm and real, like stepping out of a narrow space into an open field. "Well," he said. "That's better." Sharp Claw made that sound again, the one that might have been a laugh. They gave him water and something to eat, small dense goblin bread that tasted like almonds and iron, which was strange but not unpleasant, and then Griphook led him to a different room, this one more like an office, with proper chairs and a desk, and a ledger that was already open. The ledger was for the Potter accounts. Harry sat down and looked at it, and even partially drained, even after years of the financial redirectors funneling gold away, what remained was significant. More than significant. The Potter family had been wealthy for a very long time, and what had been taken didn't erase what had been there before it. Where was it going? Harry asked. The redirected gold. Griphook laid a second sheet of parchment on the desk. A trust account. One managed by the designated magical guardian. He paused. The designated magical guardian of the Potter estate is Albus Dumbledore. Of course it was. How much, total? What was redirected over 6 years? Griphook told him. Harry looked at the number. He looked at it for a while, doing math in his head. Then he looked up. And the Peveril accounts? The Peveril estate has been in stasis since the last confirmed Peveril heir, which is you, through maternal descent via a branch that predates the modern wizarding registry. The account has been accruing interest. Griphook set a third sheet next to the second. It was not redirected because Dumbledore did not know it existed. The Peveril legacy is older than the current system of magical guardianship. It predates Dumbledore's appointment as your guardian by approximately 1,000 years. It has simply been waiting. Harry looked at the third number. This one was significantly larger than the second. He thought, almost absurdly, about Vernon complaining last week about the cost of petrol. And the Black account, the adoption bond. That one is locked by Lord Black's current status and the absence of a formal declaration. Until his legal situation is resolved, that inheritance is held in trust. But the bond is real, and Goblin law recognizes it. Harry leaned back in the chair. He was 9 years old and he had spent the better part of this day finding out that the most powerful wizard in Britain had systematically dismantled his life before he was old enough to understand what a life was. He sat with this information the way he sat with most hard things, calmly, without performing emotion for anyone's benefit, sorting through it for what was useful. "I need a plan," he said. "Not just for the money or the lordships. For all of it. Sirius Black's case, the Wisingamot, Dumbledore's guardianship, all of it. And I need someone who can help me build it, because I'm 9 and I've never had a proper education and I don't know the legal system." Sharp Claw, who had followed them in and was sitting in the third chair, interlaced his long fingers. "Gringotts has legal representation. I know. But I need to understand what I'm asking you to do before I ask it, so I know what I'm agreeing to." Harry looked at him directly. "What does Gringotts want?" "Not in general, out of this specifically. You've been watching this happen to my accounts for years. You had to have known something was wrong. Why didn't you act before now?" The pause that followed was a different kind of pause, heavier, with more in it. "We cannot act on behalf of a client who has not come to us," Sharp Claw said, slowly and carefully. "That is Goblin law, as binding on us as any of the bindings we removed from you today. A minor with a designated magical guardian, even a guardian of whom we are deeply suspicious, cannot be acted for without their presence and their blood consent. But you were suspicious. We were, Sharpclaw said. He didn't apologize for the wait. He didn't pretend it had been comfortable. He simply said, yes. We were. Harry nodded. This was honest, and he valued honest above almost everything else, because honesty was the scarcest thing in his experience. All right. What do you get out of helping me? And this, apparently, was the question they'd been waiting for. Griphook and Sharpclaw exchanged a look. Then Sharpclaw said, the Goblin Nation has long-standing grievances against the wizarding establishment. Dumbledore is not merely the chief warlock, he is the architect of much of the current political settlement that continues to disadvantage our people. His fall, if it comes, creates possibilities. A pause. We are not asking you to fight our battles. We are observing that our interests are aligned. A Lord Potter who owes Gringotts a significant political debt, and who understands from personal experience the cost of institutional betrayal, is a Lord Potter we can work with. Harry thought about this. He thought about it honestly, turning it over, looking at it from multiple angles, not dismissing it because it was transactional or because Sharpclaw hadn't wrapped it in reassuring language. That's fair, he said. I want it formal, though. Written. Terms that are specific and limited, not a blank debt. He paused. I've learned today that blank agreements are how people take things from you. Sharpclaw looked at him for a long moment. Then he said something in gobbledygook to Griphook, and Griphook left the room. He is going to get a contract specialist, Sharpclaw said. You are right to insist on specifics. It is, in fact, the first properly goblin thing a wizard has ever said to me. Harry almost smiled. I'll take that as a compliment. It is one. They spent another hour on the contract, and it was the most focused work Harry had done in his life, which wasn't saying much since his life had consisted mostly of chores and avoiding Dudley, but he threw himself into it with complete attention. He asked questions, a lot of questions, and he didn't let anything pass that he didn't understand, and twice he caught phrasing that he thought was too broad and asked for it to be narrowed, and both times Sharpclaw looked at him with that sharpened attention expression and complied. The terms were these: Gringotts would provide legal representation for Harry's Wizengamot actions at cost, with payment deferred until Harry's majority. Gringotts would provide a safe residence from their portfolio of secured properties, at a monthly rate to be deducted from the Potter vaults. Gringotts would provide access to the heritage records of all three families. In return, Harry would, upon reaching majority and assuming his lordships, support in the Wizengamot 3 specific pieces of legislation regarding goblin banking rights that had been blocked for the last 60 years. He reserved the right to review each piece of legislation before committing a vote. Neither party was bound beyond what was written. Sharpclaw signed it with a signature that looked like something between a rune and a very angry bird. Harry signed it with his name, and then, because some instinct told him to, pressed his thumb, still faintly tender from the blood ritual, to the parchment. It sealed with a pulse of warm gold. Good, Sharpclaw said. Now. Your immediate situation. The residence at Privet Drive. I need to go back today, Harry said. It'll be noticed if I don't. But I don't want to stay there indefinitely. No, Sharpclaw agreed. We will have a suitable property prepared within the week. The question is the matter of your guardianship. While Dumbledore legally holds that appointment, removing yourself from the Dursley residence without authorization could create complications. Then we file the Wizengamot petition to challenge the guardianship first, Harry said. How long does that take? To file? Days. To be heard? Griphook tilted his head. Weeks to months, depending on the scheduling and whether the chief warlock, he stopped. Whether Dumbledore uses his position as chief warlock to delay it, Harry finished. Yes. He will. He thought. Is there a way to file it in a way that he can't delay? A procedural route? If the petition is accompanied by evidence of a crime, Sharpclaw said carefully, it bypasses the chief warlock's scheduling authority and goes directly to the full Wisengamot within 30 days. Then we file with the evidence of the bindings. The blood ritual results count as evidence. Goblin heritage ritual results are admissible in the Wisengamot and have been for 200 years. Then that's what we do. Harry stood up, straightening Dudley's enormous jeans with as much dignity as the situation allowed. I'll come back on Wednesday. Can I see the family vault tomorrow? I want to know what's there, not just the gold. The documents, the heirlooms, anything that might be useful. Griphook nodded. We will have it ready. Harry looked at Sharpclaw. Thank you, he said. For the ritual. For being honest with me. Sharpclaw stood, which Harry understood as an acknowledgement. You are the first Potter to walk through those doors in 11 years, the old goblin said. I had wondered what kind of person you would be. And? Sharpclaw considered this with visible seriousness. Better than expected, he said. Come back Wednesday. Bring your questions. I'll have a lot of them. I would be disappointed if you didn't. Harry walked back through the corridors of Gringotts and out through the main hall, past the counters and the controlled chaos and the smell of old decisions, and he came out onto the marble steps in the late afternoon sun and stood there for a moment, looking down at Diagon Alley. Everything was the same. The cobblestones, the shop fronts, the people moving in the golden light. And everything was completely different, because Harry was different, because the thing that had been sitting on him, on his magic, on his future, on his actual life, since before he could form memories had been lifted off, and the world was bigger and clearer and his in a way it had never been before. 7 bindings. 7 deliberate acts by a man who wrote letters full of wisdom and was called the greatest wizard of the age. 7 decisions, made about a baby, made about a toddler, made about someone who had no ability to consent or resist or even understand what was being done to them. Harry walked down the steps and back along the alley in the warm evening light, and he was thinking very clearly, the way he always thought most clearly when things were at their worst, and what he was thinking was this: he was 9 years old, and he had no formal education, and he was small for his age, and the most powerful man in Wizarding Britain had done everything he could to ensure Harry stayed powerless and ignorant and small. And all of that was about to become Dumbledore's problem. He bought a meat pie from a cart near the leaky cauldron because he'd missed lunch and dinner was hours away and the goblin bread had been sustaining but not exactly filling, and he ate it walking back through Muggle London toward Privet Drive, thinking through steps, ordering his thoughts, building the shape of what came next. His magic moved in him, warm and vast and no longer constrained, and he kept it quiet because a busy London street was not the place, but he could feel it there, the full weight of what he was supposed to have been all along, and it felt like a promise he was making to himself. 7 curses. 3 stolen lordships. 6 years of drained gold. He'd want all of it back, with interest. Albus Dumbledore was going to find out exactly what he tried so hard to prevent. The boy who was supposed to stay small was already making plans. Chapter 2, What the Ledgers Remember. The Potter Vault was deeper than Harry expected. Gringotts operated on a principle of spatial honesty: the deeper the vault, the older the family, the greater the trust the Goblin Nation had extended across centuries. Most wizarding families kept their vaults on the upper levels, accessible by cart on the main rails. The Potter Vault was on a sublevel that required a separate cart, a different goblin driver, and a key that Griphook handled with both hands and a particular kind of careful attention that Harry noticed and filed away. "How deep are we?" Harry asked, as the cart descended through a passage that was older than the ones above, rougher stone, the lamp brackets shaped differently, the air cooler and carrying a faint mineral smell. "Deep enough that the wards here predate the current British Ministry of Magic by roughly 400 years, Griphook said, without looking away from the track ahead. "Potter family magic is in the stone itself, down here. It recognizes you." Harry put his hand flat against the cart's side rail and felt, very faintly, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The stone walls caught the cart's lamp light and for just a second seemed to lean slightly inward, the way a crowd of people leans towards something interesting. "It does," Harry agreed. The vault door was iron and silver, 10 feet high, with no visible lock. When Harry touched it with the same index finger he'd used for the blood ritual, still lightly scabbed, it opened immediately, silently, like something that had been waiting. Inside was not what he expected, which was a room full of gold. There was gold, a significant amount of it, stacked in the careful organized manner of a family that had been depositing for centuries rather than spending, but it occupied maybe a third of the total space. The rest was shelves, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and the shelves held everything else. Documents in sealed cases. Books, some of them very old, the kind where the covers had gone soft and the pages had taken on the particular golden brown of extreme age. Objects wrapped in cloth or stored in specialized containers, some of them glowing faintly. A weapons rack on the far wall with 3 items on it, each one shimmering with enchantment visible even to Harry's eye. A locked chest at the base of the left shelves with a different kind of ward on it, something that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Harry stood in the entrance for a moment, just looking. "Take whatever time you need," Griphook said, from outside. "I will wait." Harry went in. He started with the documents, because he was 9 and the weapons were tempting for exactly that reason, and he'd learned to do the hard thing first. The document cases were labeled in a very old-fashioned cramped script that was difficult to read but not impossible. He'd been reading since he was 4, had taught himself from Dudley's discarded schoolbooks and library visits squeezed into Saturday afternoons when Aunt Petunia had errands and forgot to lock him in, and he worked through them methodically. Property deeds. Potter lands, plural, 3 estates besides the primary one, locations he didn't recognize, all apparently currently maintained on automatic trust with Gringotts as caretaker. He set these aside. Letters between previous Lord Potters and various historical figures, spanning what looked like at least 3 centuries, useful later, context for the family's political standing. Financial records going back further than he could currently process. And at the back of the deepest shelf, in a case sealed with a different kind of lock, a blood lock, he recognized, having just spent an entire yesterday having those removed from himself, a set of documents that made his breath stop slightly when he opened it. His parents' will. He hadn't known there was a will. He'd known, in the vague way that children know things that adults don't tell them directly, that his parents were dead, killed when he was a baby, in a way that was never quite explained, by someone who was never quite named, in a context that Petunia referred to only as, their sort of business. He'd known the Dursleys were his only family, because that's what Dumbledore's letter had said, the one Petunia kept in the kitchen drawer and had shown him once, stonily, when he was 6 and had asked why no one else ever came. He sat down on the floor of the vault, cross-legged, with the will in both hands, and read it. It was dated October 31st, 1981. The day they died. James and Lily Potter, being of sound mind, etc. He skimmed the formal language, looking for the substance, primary guardianship in event of death to be assigned to Sirius Orion Black, godfather, or in case of Sirius Black's incapacity or death, to Frank and Alice Longbottom, or in case of their incapacity or death, to Remus John Lupin. Albus Dumbledore was not mentioned as a guardian. He was not mentioned anywhere in the will at all. Harry read this paragraph 3 times. Albus Dumbledore had no legal authority over him. His parents had not given it. It had been taken, the will buried, apparently never submitted to the Wizengamot for probate, the legitimate guardians either imprisoned, incapacitated, or simply not informed, and a man his parents had never appointed had stepped into the vacuum and settled there like something that intended to stay. He put the will down very carefully on the stone floor, smoothed it flat, and sat for a moment. Then he picked it up, walked back to the vault door, and said to Griphook, "I need a preservation copy of this made. Can Gringotts do that?" Griphook looked at what he was holding. "Yes. Today. Today. And I need it certified. Official Gringotts seal, dated, attested by 2 senior staff. The kind of copy that's admissible in the Wizengamot without question. Come with me." They left the vault open. Griphook assured him nothing could enter without his blood permission, and went to a copying room 2 levels up, where a goblin specialist produced 3 certified copies of the will, sealed in individual cases, within half an hour. Harry put one copy in the vault, kept one, and gave one to Griphook for the Gringotts legal files. When they got back to the vault, Harry spent another 3 hours. He found a journal his father had kept, age 14 to 17, which he didn't read right now but set very carefully in the pile of things to take. He found his mother's research notes. Lily Potter had apparently been a potions researcher of significant reputation, and her notes were dense and cross-referenced and completely beyond his current ability to understand, but he set them aside too. He found the locked chest, and when he put his hand on it, it opened, blood recognition again, and inside were 3 objects that made Griphook, when Harry brought them to the door to ask about them, go very quiet. The Peveril heirlooms, Griphook said, with the tone of someone who had read about a thing in historical texts and had not expected to see it in person. Harry looked at them. A cloak, folded, that seemed to fold more than physically possible, like it was folding into a space that didn't quite exist. A stone, dark and smooth, warm in his palm in a way that felt different from the vault's magical warmth, older, more personal. And a wand. Very short, very dark, with a core he couldn't identify but could feel, a resonance that was almost painful in its intensity. I thought the Hallows were a story, Harry said. So did most wizards. Griphook looked at the wand with the focused attention of someone doing serious professional assessment. The Elder Wand is, this isn't the Elder Wand, Harry said, looking at the short wand. That's in a story about a man who wanted to win every duel. This is, he stopped, because the wand was humming very faintly, and what he felt from it wasn't aggression or ambition but something quieter. Something like recognition. This is different. The Peveril family had 3 sons, Griphook said carefully. The stories focus on the eldest's wand. The youngest's cloak has some documentation. The middle brother's stone is spoken of. He paused. There are older accounts, in goblin archives, that record a 4th object. One that was never given a clear name in the human stories. A 4th brother? Harry looked up. Possibly. Griphook's expression made it clear he wasn't going to speculate further right now, and Harry accepted this, filing it for later. He put the cloak on. He disappeared entirely, perfectly, without effort, not hidden, not obscured, actually absent from visible existence, and when he took it off he was there again, and a young goblin who'd walked past with a trolley of ledgers stopped and stared at him with unconcealed shock. Right, Harry said, folding the cloak and setting it with the other things. I'm taking these. He left the vault 4.5 hours after entering it, carrying a small pack that the vault had apparently been expecting him to need. He found it on a hook behind the door, packed with preservation charms, sized for easy carry, containing the will copies, his father's journal, the Peveril heirlooms, and 3 books from the shelves that he'd selected on the basis of having titles that suggested they would be immediately useful. Potter Family Legal Standing, A Comprehensive History. The Peveril Line and Magical Inheritance, and, most promisingly, Goblin Wizard Legal Interface, a Practitioner's Guide, which was exactly what it sounded like and had apparently been placed in the Potter Vault by an extremely practical ancestor. Sharpclaw was waiting in the office when Griphook brought Harry up. The old goblin had a folder on the desk, thick with parchment, and an expression of someone who had spent the night doing research and found things that had confirmed his worst suspicions. Sit, he said. I have the full accounting. Harry sat, took out a piece of parchment and a pencil. He'd thought to bring both, in the same way he'd thought to bring a spare pair of socks, and said, go ahead. Sharpclaw laid it out with the precision of someone who had worked with numbers for a very long time and understood that clarity was a form of respect. The Potter vaults, at the time of James and Lily's deaths, had held a sum that Sharpclaw quoted in galleons and then translated into Muggle pounds at Harry's request, because Harry knew what pounds could buy and the galleon number was abstract to him. In Muggle pounds, it was a figure with 8 digits. In the 6 years since, through a combination of the financial redirector bindings and Dumbledore's unilateral management of the estate as a legal guardian, approximately 40% of the liquid assets have been moved to the guardian's trust account. What did he spend it on? Harry asked. That is more difficult to establish without access to the trust account's outgoing ledgers, Sharpclaw said. But we have filed for disclosure as part of the Wiesengemot petition preparation. Gringotts is legally permitted to request an accounting of any trust account that draws from a client vault, and that accounting is legally required to be provided within 60 days. 60 days, Harry said. He'll move things before then. He will try. There are protections in goblin law that limit his ability to liquidate the trust once an inquiry is open. A pause. He does not yet know an inquiry is open. Harry looked up from his parchment. When will he know? When we file the Wiesengemot petition. Which I propose to do in 4 days, to give our legal team time to prepare the documentation package fully. Sharpclaw folded his hands. I want to be clear about what we are submitting. The heritage ritual results, establishing the 7 bindings and their magical signature. Certified copies of your parents' will, establishing that Dumbledore had no legitimate guardianship appointment. The financial records of the redirector bindings and their destination account. The core suppressor documentation, which is particularly significant. Suppressing a minor's magical core without consent is a violation of the Charter of Magical Rights, Article 9. He paused. The killing curse variants are the most serious charge of all, and I want to be careful about how we present them. Why careful? Because Dumbledore will claim, and some will believe him, that they were protection. That they were part of the blood protection that was placed on the Dursley residence. Harry thought about this. Are they? No, Sharpclaw said flatly. We have had our specialist team analyze the fragments we removed. The blood protection at the Dursley residence is a separate working, well-documented, placed by your mother's sacrifice. These are distinct, darker, deliberately constructed for sustained consumption rather than protection, and keyed specifically to your core rather than to the location. He paused. They are, to use a legal term, weaponized. Weaponized. Harry wrote the word down, because it was exactly the right word, and exactly the word that would matter when this was presented to people who might be inclined to give Dumbledore the benefit of the doubt. 7 weaponized bindings placed on a child before the age of 2, he said, reading his own notes back. No legitimate guardianship. 40% of the Potter estate redirected. 3 lordships suppressed. He looked up. What else? The Peveril estate situation is interesting, Sharpclaw said. As I mentioned yesterday, Dumbledore did not know of it, or we believe he did not. The blood registry that confirms your Peveril descent is in Gringotts records only, not in the Ministry's register, because the Peveril family predates the Ministry's record-keeping system entirely. He set a piece of parchment to the side. We intend to keep it that way, for now. It is a card to be played at the right moment. Agreed. Harry paused. The Black Estate, Sirius. Tell me what you know about his case. Sharpclaw took a breath, which, for a goblin who breathed as efficiently as he did everything else, signaled that what was coming was going to take some time. Sirius Orion Black was arrested on November 1, 1981, the day after your parents' deaths. He was accused of betraying the Potter family's location to Voldemort, and of killing 12 muggles and a wizard named Peter Pettigrew, using a single curse that also destroyed the street they were standing on. He didn't do any of it, Harry said. Our records support your position. The adoption bond between yourself and Sirius Black, the informal one that the Black family magic recognized, was placed with your parents' explicit consent, witnessed by Gringotts at the time of your christening. It is in our records. More significantly, the method of accusation is irregular. Sirius Black received no trial. He was transported to Azkaban within 48 hours of his arrest, on the authority of. Sharpclaw looked at the parchment in a way that suggested he already knew what it said and was choosing his tone carefully. Bartemius Crouch Sr., then head of magical law enforcement, who signed the Azkaban order on the grounds of wartime emergency powers. He paused. Albus Dumbledore co-signed. Harry was quiet for a moment. Dumbledore knew he was innocent. We cannot establish that definitively, Sharpclaw said carefully. We can establish that Dumbledore co-signed the emergency order that sent him to Azkaban without trial. We can establish that Dumbledore, as Chief Warlock, had the authority to require a trial and did not use it. We can establish that in the years since, Dumbledore has made no public statement about Sirius Black's case despite having that authority. He set the parchment down. What that tells you about his knowledge is a matter of inference. It tells me enough, Harry said. Then, after a pause, what's Sirius's condition? Do you know? Griphook, quiet in the corner chair, said, we have some information. Gringotts has no direct access to Azkaban, but we have conducted business with the Black Estate, before it was locked pending Lord Black status, and in that capacity have received reports. He hesitated, and goblins, in Harry's brief but intensive experience, didn't hesitate lightly. He is alive. He has been there nearly 8 years. Azkaban's Dementors, the extended effects of that proximity, he stopped. Don't sugarcoat it, Harry said. Griphook met his eyes. He is not well. Long-term Dementor exposure at the proximity Azkaban prisoners experience causes cumulative psychological damage. The happier the person, the more the Dementors have to work with, and Sirius Black was, by all accounts, before his arrest, an exceptionally vital person. A pause. 8 years of that is significant. Harry sat with this for a moment. He didn't know Sirius, not really, not personally. He had no memory of the man from before the Dursleys. He'd been 18 months old, but he felt something about it that was more specific than abstract sympathy. His parents' friend. His godfather. The person who was supposed to have taken him in, who would have taken him in, who had been removed so efficiently and so early that the loss barely registered in the official record. Innocent and in Azkaban because 2 powerful men had decided it was convenient. Getting him out is a priority, Harry said. How do we do it? A formal appeal of the Azkaban order requires a full Wizengamot hearing, Sharpclaw said. That is not a fast process. However, if we can establish, through the petition we're already filing, that his imprisonment was irregularly authorized, the emergency order, the lack of trial, Dumbledore's co-signature in light of what we know about Dumbledore's actions, it may be possible to apply for an emergency review. He paused. There is also the matter of Peter Pettigrew. Harry's pencil stopped on the parchment. You said the street was destroyed. Pettigrew was killed. His finger was found, Sharpclaw said. 1 finger. And his name appears on the official record as a casualty. But, he laid another piece of parchment on the desk, this one older, with goblin annotations in red ink. Peter Pettigrew held a small account with Gringotts. Student savings, opened when he attended Hogwarts. It has had no activity since 1981, which would be consistent with death. But the account is not flagged as deceased in our system, because the death has never been formally confirmed to Gringotts by next of kin or ministry documentation. He paused. A flagging that we are legally required to update only upon receiving official confirmation. Harry understood what Sharpclaw was telling him. He might be alive. We have no evidence either way. We have a lack of formal death confirmation, which is a small thing but notable. Sharpclaw's expression was careful and precise. If Peter Pettigrew were alive, his testimony would end Sirius Black's imprisonment immediately. And if he were discovered to be alive, the question of how the official record came to say otherwise would be very interesting indeed. How do we find him? That is not Gringotts' immediate area of expertise. But we have contacts. Sharpclaw allowed a pause. Consider it a parallel track. The Wizengamot petition moves through official channels. The question of Pettigrew is investigated quietly. He looked at Harry steadily. You should understand that what you are building here is not a single action. It is a campaign. Each piece supports the others. Each piece creates pressure. Dumbledore is formidably positioned. He has the ministry, the Wizengamot chair, the Order of the Phoenix, the general goodwill of the wizarding public. You cannot move him with a single strike. You must build a structure that is more solid than his, one piece at a time. I know, Harry said. I'm 9. I have time. Yes, Sharpclaw said. You do. They spent the rest of the morning reviewing the petition draft. Harry read every word of it, slowly, carefully, asking questions when he hit legal terminology he didn't understand, which Sharpclaw answered without condescension. The petition named Dumbledore specifically on 4 counts: irregular assumption of guardianship, financial malfeasance, violation of the Charter of Magical Rights, and infliction of dark magical bindings on a minor. The 5th count, the killing curse variance, was listed separately, because it carried different legal weight, a weight that fell not under the heading of magical law violations but under the heading of criminal assault. Will the Wizengamot take this seriously? Harry asked. Given that he's the chief warlock. The petition goes to a panel of 7 Wizengamot members selected by lot, Sharpclaw said. The chief warlock has no influence over the selection and is recused from any matter in which he has a personal interest, which this clearly is. He'll try to argue that he doesn't have a personal interest. He can argue that. The counter-argument, that a man accused of a crime cannot preside over proceedings related to that crime, is considerably more persuasive, and we will make it emphatically. Harry nodded. He flipped back through his notes, looking at the structure of what they'd built, the petition, the vault contents, the will, the financial records, the serious parallel track, and thought about what was missing. The magical world doesn't know any of this, he said. The public. They think Dumbledore is, what? The greatest wizard alive. The savior. The man who defeated Grindelwald. Yes. And they think I'm the boy who lived. A symbol. Something that belongs to the story. Also yes. Harry looked at his parchment. At some point, the public narrative matters. Dumbledore's power isn't just legal or political, it's emotional. People trust him. He paused. I don't want to manage a propaganda campaign, but I also can't afford for the first time anyone hears my name to be in a headline that Dumbledore's already shaped. He thought for a moment. Is there anyone in the wizarding press who is independent? Who doesn't owe him? Sharpclaw and Griphook exchanged a look. There is one journalist of note, Griphook said slowly. Xenophilius Lovegood. He runs a publication called The Quibbler. It is considered eccentric by the mainstream wizarding press. His content frequently concerns itself with things others dismiss, and his editorial position is genuinely independent. He has printed pieces critical of Dumbledore before, though they were easy to dismiss because of the publication's reputation. Eccentric but honest? As far as we can determine, yes. Keep his name. We might need him later. Harry put his pencil down and looked at the stack of paperwork with the expression he generally used for very large piles of Dudley's hand-me-down laundry that needed sorting, not daunted, just practical. 4 days to file. Between now and then I need to go back to Privet Drive, behave normally, and start reading. He held up the pack from the vault. There's a lot to learn. There is one more thing, Sharpclaw said, and his tone shifted slightly, becoming more careful. Before you leave today. Harry looked at him. Your magical core, now unbound. Since yesterday. The goblin paused. You will have noticed it. Yes. It is not fully integrated yet. The binding was removed, but the core was compressed for 9 years. It must expand into its full capacity gradually, and during that expansion period, you will experience what we call breakthrough phenomena. Magic expressing itself without conscious direction. Harry thought about the last night at Privet Drive, sleeping in the cupboard, and how he had woken up at 2 in the morning to find that every object on the shelf above his mattress, a broken alarm clock, 2 of Dudley's old toy soldiers, a dead houseplant Petunia had exiled there, had been neatly rearranged into a pattern he didn't consciously choose. He had put them back and gone to sleep and not mentioned it because when had mentioning things ever helped? It's already happening, he said. Then you need control exercises. Goblin methods are different from wizarding ones, more structural, less intuitive, but given your circumstances, I believe they will serve you better than waving a wand and hoping. Sharpclaw reached under the desk and produced a thin book, no larger than a pocket notebook, with a plain gray cover. Start with this. 20 minutes, morning and evening. Do not skip. Harry took it, turned it over in his hands. Thank you. He looked up. Genuinely. You didn't have to help me the way you have. The contract covers the legal work, but this, he gestured vaguely at the book, at the hours of honest explanation, at the care that had been taken in presenting everything to him clearly. Sharpclaw looked at him with those ancient yellow eyes. Competence that goes unrecognized is a waste, he said. That is a goblin principle. Your competence has been not merely unrecognized but actively suppressed for 9 years. He paused. I find waste offensive. On a personal level. Harry almost laughed, and this time it almost came all the way out. He was back at Privet Drive by 5 in the afternoon, slipping in through the back garden gate with a quiet ease that 10 years of practiced invisibility had made second nature. He ate the dinner Petunia left him without being asked about his day, washed up, and retired to the cupboard with the pack from Gringotts, which he'd made look like an ordinary backpack by stowing it inside a Tesco bag. He read for 5 hours. The Potter family legal history was dense but organized in a way that was clearly intended for a non-specialist reader. Some ancestor had written it for exactly this situation, a Potter heir who might come to it without preparation. He learned that the Potter family had held a seat on the Wisengamot for 6 generations, that they had traditionally aligned with neither the conservative nor the progressive faction but had operated as independent brokers, that their political influence had been significant but understated, exercised through relationships rather than public positioning. The Peveril material was older and stranger, the magical theory in it was well beyond him for now, but the legal content was clear enough. The Peveril Lordship was the oldest surviving claim in the British Magical Registry, predating everything, and its holder had a specific set of rights and authorities that no subsequent legislation had ever bothered to explicitly remove because no one had remembered to. He read the Goblin Wizard legal interface book until the words blurred, and found 3 specific provisions he flagged with torn strips of Dudley's old homework: the provision about petitioning for emergency guardianship review, the provision about minor rights under the Charter, and a third provision, tucked in an appendix, that was so useful he read it twice to make sure he was understanding it correctly. Under Section 7 of the Magical Inheritance Act of 1703, a minor holding a confirmed lordship could, with appropriate legal representation, appear before the Wisengamot in their own right, bypassing the requirement for a guardian's attendance, on any matter directly pertaining to that lordship. He didn't need a guardian to appear before the Wisengamot. He only needed his lordship. Which he had. He put the book down and sat in the dark of the cupboard, which smelled like dust and old shoes and the specific particular smell of the small space he'd lived in for as long as he could remember, and he thought about Dumbledore sitting in a comfortable office somewhere, absolutely certain that everything was under control, that the instruments he checked daily to monitor Harry would show a boy reduced and bound and safely contained. Those instruments were going to be extremely confused right now. He reached into the pack and took out the control exercise book Sharpclaw had given him. Plain gray cover, small and dense, goblin characters that he'd need translated, but on the first page, someone had written a note in neat English, evidently anticipating an English-speaking reader: the core does not need to be controlled. It needs to be known. Begin here. Below it were exercises. He did 20 minutes, sitting cross-legged on his thin mattress with his eyes closed and the cupboard silent around him, and felt his magic settle into him the way water settles into a vessel, finding its own level, and what he found was that it was very large and very patient and had been waiting a long time. It knew him too. He slept well for the first time in recent memory, and in the morning he started the books again over breakfast while the Dursleys moved around him with their usual elaborate performance of not quite looking at him, and in the back of his mind he was building something, a structure of knowledge and leverage and precisely calibrated action, and it was growing cleaner and stronger with every hour. On Wednesday he went back to Gringotts and met with Sharpclaw and the Gringotts legal team, 3 sharp-eyed goblins in formal robes who had been working on the petition since Monday and had it ready for his review. Harry sat with them for 3 hours, reading and questioning, and made 2 small changes to the document that the senior legal goblin, Brass Coin, with a voice like a file on metal, looked at with narrowed eyes before admitting were improvements to the argument structure. "Where did you learn to read legal text?" Brass Coin asked, with the tone of someone asking where you bought a coat they admired. "I started yesterday," Harry said. Brass Coin looked at Griphook. Griphook tilted his head in an expression that very clearly communicated "I told you so." The petition was filed Thursday morning. Harry was back in Privet Drive's garden, nominally weeding, when it was delivered by Goblin Courier to the Wisengamot Registry Office. He didn't know he'd feel it, didn't know anything about it, but at the exact moment the petition was stamped and accepted into the official record, he felt a small, precise click somewhere in his chest. Like a lock opening. Like the first domino falling. He pulled a dandelion out of the bed by the root and set it aside and kept working, and waited. He didn't wait long. That evening, Friday, barely 24 hours after filing, Petunia came to find him in the garden with an expression so carefully composed it told him everything. She was frightened. Not of him. Of something connected to him that she didn't understand but recognized. "There is a letter for you," she said, handing it over with 2 fingers, like it might bite, which all things considered was not an entirely irrational concern. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, with a wax seal, not the ministry's seal, not Hogwarts. The seal was a set of scales, balanced, with a line of goblin script beneath that Harry could now read, "Gringotts Wizarding Bank, acting in the matter of Potter vs. Dumbledore, case reference 1990, GWB 047. Official correspondence." The Wisengamot had acknowledged receipt. But that wasn't the interesting letter. The interesting letter arrived Saturday morning, by a large, somewhat imperious owl that landed on the garden fence and fixed Harry with the expression of an owl that was accustomed to delivering important correspondence to important people and was reserving judgment on whether this address met those standards. The seal on this one was different. A wand and caduceus crossed over a griffin, in black wax. Harry didn't recognize the seal immediately, but the name on the letter's back identified the sender, Augusta Longbottom. He broke the seal and read. "Mr. Potter," it began, without preamble or pleasantry, which he appreciated immediately. "I am in receipt of a notification from the Wisengamot Registry that a petition has been filed in your name, by Gringotts Legal Representation, regarding certain matters pertaining to your guardianship and estate. As a matter of standard procedure for major petitions, the registry notifies sitting members of the Wisengamot. I am a sitting member of the Wisengamot. I have been for 31 years. I am also the grandmother of Neville Frank Longbottom, whom you may have heard of, and I have for several years had significant concerns about certain irregular matters pertaining to his magical development. The nature of your petition is public record. I have read it carefully. I would very much like to meet you at your earliest convenience. The matter is urgent. Augusta Longbottom, Lady Longbottom, House Longbottom. P.S. Come for tea. Wednesday, 2 o'clock. Do not be late. The owl knows the way." Harry read it twice, and then read it again, and then looked at the owl, which was regarding him with continued judgment. "Wednesday," he told it. "I'll be there." The owl appeared to accept this, and left. Harry went inside to find the control exercise book and did his 20 minutes with a particular focused quality, because the shape of what he was building had just grown a new wing, and he needed to think carefully about how to fit it in without compromising the structure already standing. Neville Longbottom. Irregular matters pertaining to magical development. He thought about what that might look like, from the outside. A child whose magic wasn't working the way it should. A child who might appear to have very little gift, because something was limiting what could come through. A child who might have been told, or allowed to believe, that they simply weren't especially magical. He thought about what Sharpclaw had told him, 2 days ago, that he'd filed away in the useful later section, competence that goes unrecognized is a waste. He thought about what Dumbledore had needed from the prophecy situation, which Harry had found, in his parents' legal papers, a heavily redacted ministry copy of, enough to understand its general shape. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born as the 7th month dies. Born at the end of July. He was born July 31st, Neville Longbottom, he was fairly sure, was born July 30th, Dumbledore had chosen Harry. Which meant that at some point, Dumbledore had looked at 2 children, both of whom qualified, and made a decision. And Harry had spent 9 years living with that decision's consequences. But if Dumbledore had chosen Harry, then Neville had been, what? Dismissed? Overlooked? Left alone? Or, the thought arrived with the particular cold clarity of something important, left as insurance. A backup. A child who could be shaped into a weapon if the first weapon failed. Harry put the book down, very carefully. Wednesday's tea was suddenly one of the most important things on his immediate calendar. He spent the weekend reading, doing his exercises, being as invisible as the Dursleys required, and thinking. On Monday he walked to the public library and used their reference section to look up 3 things, the history of British wizarding law, the Charter of Magical Rights, and, on a whim that turned out to be productive, the history of the Black family, which was documented in a surprising amount of Muggle genealogical record because the Blacks had been prominent enough in Muggle society as well as magical to appear in Burke's peerage. On Tuesday he wrote a letter to Sharpclaw with a question that had come to him while reading the Inheritance book: if the Longbottom family had experienced something similar to what had happened to the Potter estate, would Gringotts be able to identify it? What would it look like in the records? The reply came back by Goblin courier within 2 hours, which was very fast and told him that his instinct had been worth having. Preliminary review of Longbottom account activity, Sharpclaw wrote, in his cramped precise hand, indicates irregular patterns consistent with what you are describing. Further investigation would require a heritage ritual for the Longbottom heir, which would require his presence and consent. We await your further communication on this matter with interest. Harry folded the letter and put it with the others. He had a meeting with Augusta Longbottom in less than 24 hours, and he had a very specific proposal to make. He did his evening exercises with particular care, feeling his magic moving in him, settling and deepening, the expansion Sharpclaw had described continuing steadily. It was very large. He was beginning to get a real sense of its scale, the way you get a real sense of a room's size once you've turned the lights on properly, and what he found was that it filled the space of him completely, and that the space of him was, apparently, quite large. He went to sleep early, with his father's journal tucked under his pillow because he'd started reading it that evening, age 14, his father's voice coming through in the casual run-on sentences and the jokes and the passionate unreasonable enthusiasm for Quidditch, and lay in the dark of the cupboard, which was feeling less like a cell and more like a temporary situation, and thought about everything. 2 children. 1 prophecy. 1 old man who had decided that the future was his to arrange. The arrangement was ending. Harry closed his eyes, and his magic settled around him like something that had found its way home, and he slept. Chapter 3, Letters written in fire. Wednesday arrived cold and sharp, the sky the particular grey of English summer deciding not to bother, and Harry was up at 5:30 because he'd been up at 5:30 every morning for as long as he could remember. Early rising was a Dursley requirement so deeply ingrained it had become simply his natural state. He did his exercises first. 20 minutes, the way Sharpclaw had prescribed, but what had started 3 days ago as a careful following of the goblin notation had evolved into something more organic, because his magic was cooperating in a way that made strict adherence to the steps feel like following a recipe for something you already knew how to cook. He could feel the structure of it now, the way you feel the walls of a room in the dark, not seeing, but certain. His core moved when he asked it to, and when he didn't ask, it stayed where he put it, which was an improvement over the first 2 days when it had been expressing opinions about everything. The Tuesday incident with the kitchen ceiling would not, he had decided, be discussed. He ate breakfast, toast, because it was what was available before the Dursleys came down and he'd gotten very efficient at making it fast and quiet, and was dressed and ready and out the door by 7, carrying his pack and wearing the cleanest of Dudley's hand-me-downs, which was still 2 sizes too large but at least had no visible stains. He had 3 hours before the Gringotts meeting he'd scheduled for 9 o'clock, and then the Longbottom tea at 2, and the distance between now and both of those felt like a held breath. The leaky cauldron was quiet at this hour, only a handful of witches and wizards over their morning papers, and Harry moved through it with the practiced invisibility of long habit and was in Diagon Alley before any of them looked up. He bought a proper breakfast from a bakery near the apothecary, eggs on a roll, absurdly cheap and very good, and ate it on a bench outside Madame Malkin's, which wasn't open yet, watching the alley come to life with the particular pleasure of someone who had always eaten alone and had recently decided to stop being resentful about it and simply enjoy his own company. He'd been doing a lot of that lately. Deciding to stop being resentful about things and simply work with what was there. Resentment was a weight, and he was done carrying weights that had been placed on him without his permission. His reflection in Madame Malkin's dark window was a thin boy with untidy black hair and taped glasses and clothes that fit him like a tent, and he looked at it without much feeling, neither the shame Dudley had tried so hard to instill nor any particular vanity in the other direction. He was what he was. The clothes would be addressed. The glasses too, he'd noted from the Potter legal history that the family vault held assets sufficient for any reasonable expenditure, and he had the goblin equivalent of a bank card now, a small iron token key to his blood that could access the Potter vaults directly. He bought proper robes from Madame Malkin the moment she opened at 8:15. She measured him without comment and he picked 3 sets, not extravagant, but fitting, and when he changed in the back before leaving, the difference was extraordinary. Not because clothes made a person, but because wearing things that actually fit felt, after 9 years of the opposite, like a political statement. He wore the robes to Gringotts. Griphook was waiting in the entrance hall and looked at him with an expression that took in the change without commenting on it, which Harry appreciated. Director Ragnarok has asked to join this morning's meeting, Griphook said, as they walked back through the now familiar corridors. Harry glanced at him. What changed? Your petition was filed Thursday. By Friday morning it had generated considerable interest. A pause. Dumbledore filed a counter-response yesterday. Monday. 48 hours after receiving notification. Harry kept walking. Fast. Very. And the content is notable. Griphook's voice had a careful quality. You will want to read it yourself. The meeting room was different from the ones before, larger, with a proper conference table rather than the smaller discussion setup, and when they entered Sharpclaw was already there, and beside him was a goblin Harry hadn't met, who was introduced simply as Ragnarok without additional title, which somehow conveyed the title more clearly than any formal announcement would have. Director Ragnarok was old, older than Sharpclaw, older than anything Harry had previously thought of as old, with a face that had passed the stage of being lined and arrived at something that was more like geology, the accumulated compression of centuries into something that looked smooth because it had been so comprehensively hardened. His eyes were a dark amber, the color of old resin, and they moved across Harry with an assessment that was complete within approximately 3 seconds. Lord Potter, he said. His voice was low and very level. Sit. Harry sat. Ragnarok didn't waste time on pleasantries, which Harry had already identified as a goblin characteristic he found deeply refreshing. Dumbledore's counter-response, he said, pushing a folded document across the table. Read it. Harry unfolded it. It was 3 pages, formal Wisengamot petition language, filed on behalf of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, the full name in the formal style, and it was, Harry recognized as he read, extremely well constructed. Not because it was true, but because it was plausible, and it was built from pieces of truth arranged carefully around the lie at its center. Dumbledore claimed that the bindings placed on Harry Potter were protective measures, taken in the extraordinary circumstances following Voldemort's attack, to ensure the safety and stability of the wizarding world's primary protection, namely, the continued existence of the boy who lived. He claimed that the guardianship, while not formally appointed through standard channels, had been established through emergency powers granted to the chief warlock during wartime, a provision that, Harry noted, was real, it existed in the charter, he'd read it, but that Dumbledore was applying with extraordinary breadth. He claimed that the financial management of the Potter estate had been conducted entirely in Harry's best interest, in the absence of any other appropriate party, and that full accounting would demonstrate responsible stewardship. He acknowledged the Killing Curse variant bindings with a paragraph that was the most carefully written piece of legal misdirection Harry had read, describing them as, he had to read this twice, regenerative constraint matrices, designed to gradually release as the subject matured, ensuring controlled development of an extraordinary magical core that posed, in its unmanaged state, existential risk to surrounding muggles and magical persons alike. Regenerative constraint matrices. Harry put the document down. He's saying he caged me for everyone else's safety. Yes, Sharpclaw said. And that the Killing Curse variants were actually a kind of slow-release safety valve. That is the argument. Will anyone believe that? Ragnarok, who hadn't moved or looked away, said, some will want to. Dumbledore has spent 50 years building a reputation that functions as a cognitive shortcut. When people hear his name, they stop asking questions. That is the nature of authority constructed carefully enough. The question is not whether his argument is true. The question is whether he can sustain it long enough to delay the proceedings until he can manage the situation through other means. What other means? Harry asked. Meeting you personally, Ragnarok said. Making a case. Possibly making an offer. He paused. He will not come to you immediately, that would look reactive and he is too skilled for that, but within the next 2 to 3 weeks, expect contact. He will present himself as reasonable. He will be apologetic, perhaps. He will offer explanations. He will frame this as a misunderstanding between people who ultimately want the same thing. The old goblin's amber eyes were steady. He will be very convincing, and everything he says will be carefully constructed to move you toward a position that benefits him. I know, Harry said. A slight pause. You are 9, Ragnarok said, not dismissively, but as an observation. I know that too. Harry looked at the counter-response. His argument has 3 problems. The first is that protective bindings don't look like what these look like. Our heritage specialists' testimony on their magical structure will counter the regenerative matrix claim directly. The second is that the financial redirectors predate any legitimate emergency powers appointment, which means the stewardship claim has a timeline problem. And the third is the will. He looked up. He knows we have the will. His counter-response doesn't mention it at all. He's hoping we'll overlook it or not use it, because if the will is entered into evidence, his entire guardianship claim collapses. Emergency powers or not, my parents named specific guardians and he wasn't one of them. Ragnarok and Sharpclaw exchanged a look that was different from the usual intergoblin communication Harry had been observing. This one had more weight in it, more deliberateness. You read his counter-response in 4 minutes, Ragnarok said. I had Sharpclaw's legal guide and the inheritance book, Harry said. I'm not doing anything he didn't set up for me to be able to do. Sharpclaw gave you those materials yesterday, Ragnarok said. You read them in 1 evening. Harry waited, not sure where this was going. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, the Goblin Nation has not had a formally recognized human ally in the Wizardingmots since 1752, when the last such alliance was terminated by the Goblin Uprising laws that followed the Third Rebellion. We are not looking for a patron or a dependent. We are looking for someone who understands the concept of mutual interest and can hold to it under pressure. He paused. I want you to understand clearly what I am saying. You want to know if I'll still be useful when this is over, Harry said. When I have everything back and don't need Gringotts anymore. When you have everything back and don't need us, Ragnarok agreed, which will happen, if things proceed as they should, within the next year or 2, will you remember that you made an agreement with people who treated you as an intelligent being before you had any power at all? Harry thought about Sharpclaw, who had handed him a glass of water and a piece of goblin bread after a 2-hour ritual and explained everything clearly and translated everything honestly and given him a book not because the contract required it but because he'd assessed Harry's situation and decided what was needed. He thought about Griphook, who had called him Lord Potter when no one else in the world thought that was a real thing. He thought about Brasscoin, who had looked at his 2 legal edits with those narrowed eyes and admitted they were improvements. Yes, Harry said. I'll remember. He held Ragnar's gaze when he said it, not because he was trying to demonstrate anything but because it was true and true things didn't need decorating. Ragnar nodded once, with the finality of a decision made. Then we will discuss the counter-response strategy. They spent the next hour and a half building the response to Dumbledore's counter-response, working through each argument systematically, identifying the strongest counters and the evidence to support them. Harry took notes and asked questions and contributed 3 points of his own, including the timeline problem with the financial redirectors, which Brasscoin confirmed was a genuine legal vulnerability in Dumbledore's stewardship claim, and at the end of it had a page of dense notes and a clear sense of the shape of the next stage. "I have one more thing," Harry said, as Griphook began collecting the documents. "Augusta Longbottom wrote to me. I'm meeting her today." Sharpclaw set his document stack back down. "And?" "She has concerns about Neville Longbottom's magical development that are consistent with what you found when you did the preliminary review of the Longbottom accounts." He looked at Sharpclaw. "If Neville's been bound in a similar way, then the case expands," Ragnar said quietly. "A second child. A second set of illegal bindings. The same signature. It changes the argument from one exceptional circumstance to a pattern," Harry said. "It changes Dumbledore from a man who made hard choices once to a man who does this. That's a different thing to defend against." The room was quiet for a moment. "Do not push Lady Longbottom," Sharpclaw said carefully. "She is formidable and politically experienced and she does not like to feel managed. Present the information. Let her reach conclusions at her own pace." "I know," Harry said. "I'm not going there to convince her. I'm going there because she asked." He left Gringotts at 11:30 and spent the next hour walking, which was how he thought best, movement and fresh air and the mechanical rhythm of putting one foot in front of another, which gave his conscious mind something simple to do and freed the rest of him to work on larger problems. The larger problem currently occupying him was Dumbledore. Not the legal strategy, that was Gringotts' domain and they were formidably competent at it. The problem was the human one, the question that Ragnar's comments had sharpened: what did Dumbledore actually believe? Not what did he claim, not what would he say when confronted, but in the private working of his own mind, what did Albus Dumbledore think he was doing? Harry had been thinking about this for days, because it seemed to him that you couldn't counter an argument effectively unless you understood the person making it, and understanding Dumbledore meant understanding a thing that Harry found genuinely difficult, the architecture of a mind that could do what Dumbledore had done while maintaining, and Harry believed it was genuine, not performance, the conviction of being good. He thought about the exercises Sharpclaw had given him. The core does not need to be controlled. It needs to be known. He thought that this was probably true of most problems, not just magical cores. Dumbledore believed in the greater good. Harry had read enough of the family history and the broader wizarding political history to understand that this was the man's foundational philosophy, that individual cost was acceptable in service of collective safety. He believed that Harry was a weapon, a necessary instrument in the defeat of a darkness that genuinely threatened the world, and he believed that weapons needed to be properly calibrated, not too powerful, not too independent, controllable enough to be pointed in the right direction when the time came. He had, therefore, bound Harry. Not from malice. From strategy. Which was, Harry thought, walking past the Muggle newsstand near the Leaky Cauldron, in some ways worse. Malice was comprehensible and personal and could be directly opposed. Strategy required counter-strategy, required understanding the full board rather than just the piece attacking you. The full board, as he currently understood it, Dumbledore wanted a Harry who was manageable, who would arrive at Hogwarts sufficiently powerful to face Voldemort but sufficiently conditioned to follow direction. He had invested years in this project. He had a narrative, the boy who lived, the chosen hero, the symbol, that served a specific purpose, and he needed Harry to fit that narrative. Harry was already not fitting it. What Dumbledore would do when he realized the extent of the deviation was the central strategic question. The night bus, which Harry had discovered on his second trip to Diagon Alley through the simple method of stepping off the curb with his hand out and watching a large purple triple-decker materialize, dropped him near the postcode Augusta Longbottom's owl had indicated, in a village in Somerset that looked like someone's idea of a pleasant English afternoon given physical form: stone cottages, a church, a pub with hanging baskets of flowers, and an air of existing slightly outside of normal time. The Longbottom estate was at the village's edge, behind a gate that looked purely decorative but that Harry felt the edge of a ward over as he passed through. The house was old and large and had the particular quality of a place that had been continuously occupied and cared for by people who took its history seriously, not preserved like a museum but lived in, maintained, worn smooth in the right places. Augusta Longbottom opened the door before he knocked. She was a tall woman, somewhere in her 60s, with a spine like a flagpole and the direct gaze of someone who had spent decades in rooms where everyone else was jockeying for position and had found the experience mildly tedious. She wore robes in deep burgundy with a hat that was technically in the same general category of object as the hats Harry had seen other wizarding women wear but in practice belonged to a different species entirely. She assessed him from the doorway with complete frankness, the way you assess something you've been hearing about and finally get to see. "You're smaller than I expected," she said, by way of greeting. "People keep being surprised by that," Harry said. "I'm 9 and I was malnourished for most of it." A pause. Something shifted fractionally in her expression, not softness, exactly, but a recalibration. "Come in, then." The inside of the house was exactly what the outside promised: old, well-kept, full of the accumulated weight of a family that had been doing significant things for a very long time. Portraits in the hall, the subjects watching with varying degrees of interest as he passed. A sitting room that had seen a great many serious conversations. A tea tray already laid, which meant she'd been confident he'd arrive on time, which meant the assessment had already been made and she was past the stage of wondering who he was. There was a boy in the sitting room. Neville Longbottom was also 9, 10, Harry corrected himself, remembering the birthday, and round-faced, with brown eyes that were shy and direct in alternation, and a quality of held-breath tension about him that Harry recognized immediately because he'd felt it himself every day for 9 years. The tension of someone waiting for the next thing to go wrong. He looked at Harry with an expression that was somewhere between curious and desperately hopeful, the way someone looks at a stranger on a street who is holding the thing you've lost. "Neville," Augusta said, settling into her armchair with the practiced ease of a woman who considered herself the gravitational center of any room she entered, "this is Harry Potter." "Hi," Harry said, sitting down in the chair across from her without waiting to be invited, because he'd read enough about Wisengamot politics to know that Augusta Longbottom respected people who moved like they belonged somewhere. "Hi," Neville said, his voice slightly above a whisper. "He'll be joining us," Augusta said, looking at Harry with a directness that was also a question. "I thought it relevant." "Yes," Harry agreed, and looked at Neville properly, the way Sharpclaw had taught him without meaning to, not at the surface but at the texture underneath it. The way Neville held his teacup, like it might break or be taken. The way he sat slightly turned, as though half expecting to be told to leave. The way his magic felt, and Harry could feel it now, with his core unbound and expanded, muffled, compressed, much larger than it should be allowed to express. "It's very relevant." Neville looked at him. "You can feel it?" Quiet and direct, the shyness setting aside for a moment in favor of something urgent. "Yes." Gran said. Neville stopped, glanced at Augusta. "I said," Augusta said, in the brisk tone of someone cutting through unnecessary circumnavigation, "that I had come across information suggesting your situation, Neville, might not be what we have been told." She looked at Harry. "I have been told for 9 years that Neville is magically underdeveloped. That his core is naturally limited. That the expectations one might have had for a Longbottom heir are, in his case, misplaced." Her voice was completely even, but underneath the evenness was something that had spent 9 years being told something wrong and had just found out and was handling it with iron control. "A preliminary review of our Gringotts accounts, which I requested Monday, indicates irregular activity consistent with external binding." She paused. I want to know what you know. Harry told her. Not everything, not the full picture of the Wisengamot petition, that was too large to lead with, but the substance, the blood ritual, the bindings, what they looked like and how they'd been placed, and importantly, the magical signature. He watched her face as he spoke, and it was impressive, her ability to receive devastating information without giving it visible ground, but there was a moment, when he described the core suppressor and what it felt like to have it removed, the returning sensation of something that had always been there finally being accessible, when her jaw tightened fractionally, and she looked at Neville, just briefly, and he saw what lived underneath the iron. Neville was watching Harry with very round eyes. The signature, Augusta said, when Harry finished. You have documentation of the signature. The heritage ritual records it. Gringotts can confirm it forensically. He paused. If Neville agrees to a heritage ritual, they can tell you definitively whether the same signature is present in his bindings. If I have bindings, Neville said. You do, Harry said, not unkindly. I can feel them. Your magic is, it's like listening to someone talk through a door. You're there, it's just not getting through properly. Neville stared at him. You can actually feel other people's. It's a new development, Harry said, which was understating it, and Neville's expression suggested he appreciated the understatement. And if the ritual confirms what you believe? Augusta said. Then you have a choice to make. Harry looked at her directly. I'm filing against Dumbledore. My petition is already in. He's filed a counter-response, I have a copy if you want it, and the Wisengamot panel will be convened within 30 days. If you join the petition, if Neville's ritual confirms what I think it will, then it stops being my case and becomes something considerably larger. He paused. But I won't push you. Joining this is a significant decision. Dumbledore has allies I don't fully know yet and resources I can't entirely account for, and going against him publicly puts the Longbottom name in the middle of something that could be messy before it's clean. Augusta looked at him for a long moment. The fireplace crackled between them. On the mantel, a portrait of a man in aura robes watched the conversation with sharp eyes. Messy, she said. Yes. My daughter-in-law and my son, she said, in a tone that was completely flat and carrying an ocean beneath it, are in St. Mungo's long-term ward. They have been there since 1981. They were tortured into insanity by Death Eaters who were captured, tried, and imprisoned. She paused. Albus Dumbledore sat in the Chief Warlock's chair at those trials. He presided over those convictions. Another pause. He visited my son in St. Mungo's once, in the first year. He told me that Frank's sacrifice, and Alice's, had been necessary. That some things had to cost what they cost. She looked at Harry. He said it the way a man says something he's rehearsed because he expects to say it multiple times. Harry said nothing. I have been wondering for 9 years, she said, whether Dumbledore knew what was going to happen to them. Whether the attack on my son and his wife was anticipated. Aloud. She paused. I have wondered whether I was being paranoid. I can't tell you about that specifically, Harry said carefully. I don't have evidence about your son's attack. But I can tell you, he paused, choosing the next words with precision. A man who put killing curse variants on a baby is a man who has decided he's the only one who gets to choose what necessary means. The fire crackled. Neville had gone very still. Augusta looked at the mantel portrait for a moment, and Harry looked too, and realized the man in aura robes was Frank Longbottom, Neville's father, painted when he was whole and present and alive in the full sense, and that Augusta had been having this conversation within sight of that portrait on purpose. Wednesday of next week, she said, turning back. Neville will go to Gringotts for the heritage ritual. I will accompany him. She paused. I will also be contacting 2 other Wisengamot members who have expressed, in private, reservations about certain of Dumbledore's long-standing policy positions. I will not promise they will join the petition, that is their decision, but I will ensure they are aware of its content. She looked at Harry. I trust you understand that political capital has a cost and I am spending a significant amount of mine. I understand, Harry said. And I intend to make sure it's spent well. Augusta looked at him again with that complete directness, and this time there was something in it that was not the assessment of a politician evaluating an asset but something older and more particular, the look of someone who has been fighting alone for a very long time and has unexpectedly found someone fighting in the same direction. More tea, she said, which was not a question. Yes, please, Harry said. After the formal part of the conversation, Augusta excused herself to her study on the grounds of correspondence, which Harry suspected was also to give him and Neville a few minutes of territory that wasn't entirely adult-governed, and she was right to. Neville poured his own tea with the excessive care of someone who'd been told often enough that he broke things and had internalized it as a characteristic rather than a habit, and Harry watched and said nothing and then said, "When did you last do magic on purpose?" Neville looked up. What? Magic. On purpose. Not accident, not something that happened, something you meant to do. Neville thought about it with visible effort. "Third birthday," he said. "I made Mum's favorite flowers bloom out of season." He paused. She was okay then, mostly. She smiled. A pause. "I haven't done anything on purpose since." He stopped. "Like trying to shout through water," Harry said. Neville stared at him. "Yes. Exactly. Your magic is there," Harry said. "It's very much there. It's been there all along. Someone just decided it shouldn't be allowed out." He paused. "When we get the ritual done and the bindings off, and we will, it's going to feel very strange at first." "Strange how?" "Like suddenly being very loud in a room you've been whispering in for years." Harry thought about it. "Like, you know when you've had a cold for so long you've forgotten what your real nose feels like, and then one day it clears and you can actually breathe, and it feels enormous and strange and like too much?" Neville blinked. Then he laughed, just a little, surprised out of him. "Yes. It's like that, but for your whole magic." Harry paused. "Also things will happen without you intending them to, for a few weeks. Keep the Goblin Exercises book close. I'll ask Sharpclaw to prepare a copy." Neville looked at him with that particular hopeful directness again. "You're being You don't have to, I know," Harry said. "But I'm going to." He thought about how to explain it without it sounding like either charity or strategy and landed on the truth, which was simpler than both. "You should have had a godfather. Someone who showed up and helped." "I should have had a godfather. Mine is currently in Azkaban because the same man who bound us decided that was useful. So we don't have what we should have had, but we can have what we build." He looked at Neville steadily. "If that's all right with you." Neville was quiet for a moment, turning his teacup in his hands. Then, carefully, he said, "Gran says you're going to take Dumbledore apart." "I'm going to try. Can I help?" "Actually help, not just, I know I can't do magic properly yet, but Gran's on the Wizengamot and she taught me the rules and I know the politics. I've been listening to her since I was 4, yes," Harry said. "You can help." He paused. "What do you know about the Wizengamot procedural rules? Specifically around emergency petitions?" Neville blinked, clearly not expecting to be immediately handed a task. Then his expression changed, and something that had been holding breath and tense shifted into something more purposeful, more present, and Harry saw a glimpse of what Neville Longbottom was going to look like once his magic was properly his. Considerable, was the word for it. Emergency petitions under Section 12 require, hang on. Neville put down his teacup, sat forward, and started talking, and he didn't stop for 20 minutes. Harry took notes. He got back to Privet Drive at 6:30 to find, sitting on the front step, a letter. Not an owl-delivered letter, those he'd been collecting from the back garden to avoid Petunia's reactions. This one had been delivered by hand, slipped under the front door mat where it was barely visible, and it was sealed with a simple wax stamp that bore an image Harry didn't immediately recognize, a crescent moon through pine trees. He opened it in his room. "Mr. Potter, I understand a petition has been filed with the Wizengamot under your name. I have read it. I knew your parents. I am sorry. I should have done more in the years since. I would like, if you are willing, to meet. I can be contacted at the following address. I will understand if you choose not to respond. Remus J. Lupin." Harry read it twice. Remus Lupin. Third on the guardianship list in his parents' will, after Sirius and the Longbottoms. The last of the people who should have been there and weren't, and by the sound of the letter, knew it. He looked at the letter for a long moment. The handwriting was neat but not easy. There was something in it that suggested it had been written multiple times before arriving at this version, a careful compression of a much longer thing into something that was honest without being overwhelming. Harry reached for parchment. He wrote 3 letters that evening. The first to Sharpclaw, the Longbottom meeting, its results, the Wednesday plan for Neville's ritual, and a request for a second Goblin Exercises book. The second to Remus Lupin. Short, direct, I'm willing to meet. Next Saturday, Diagon Alley, Florian Fortescue's, noon. Don't be late. He paused before writing the third, because the third was the one he'd been thinking about for a week and hadn't yet decided on, and he was going to decide now. The third was to Xenophilius Lovegood at the Quibbler. He didn't write it as a press overture. He'd thought about that and discarded it, because the Quibbler going public too early would allow Dumbledore to control the framing, dismiss Harry's story as tabloid fantasy, and shore up his own narrative before the Wizengamot had finished. Instead, he wrote it as a private communication, identifying himself clearly and stating that he had significant information of public interest that he was not yet ready to publish but wanted to place in hands he understood to be independent and honest, and that when the time came, which would be within a few months, he would need a journalist who understood both magical law and the specific way Dumbledore's authority functioned, and who had the editorial courage to print what they found. He paused at the end, and added, "I am told you are eccentric. I'm told that by people who also thought it was reasonable to put a baby in a cupboard under some stairs, so I am disinclined to take their definition of eccentric as a disqualifying characteristic. Please write back if you're interested." He sealed all 3 with the Potter family seal, the wax stamp he'd found in the vault, worked into his ring now, a ring he hadn't known he was wearing until Griphook had told him that Lord Potter's ring would appear on his right hand when his lordship was confirmed, and so it had, a plain band of deep gold that he'd spent the first day not quite looking at and was now simply accustomed to, and went to bed. His magic moved in him, steady and large, and he did his evening exercises, the ones that were becoming less like exercises and more like conversation, and he thought about everything that had happened in the last week. 7 days ago he had been sleeping in a cupboard with no useful knowledge of his own identity, a strangled magic, and a future that stretched ahead in the shape of whatever Dumbledore needed from him. Now he had a vault, a legal team, an ally on the Wizengamot, a potential second petitioner, a Marauders List guardian making contact, a Goblin director's personal investment in his success, and a 15-year-old Peveril cloak folded under his mattress that he was absolutely not using to sneak out of the house at night. He was using it to sneak out of the house at night. Not recklessly, not wandering in a way that could be tracked or monitored, but twice he had gone out at 2 in the morning and walked in the dark under the cloak, invisible and alone, and stood in the middle of a quiet suburban street with no walls around him and his magic fully present, and just breathed. Just been what he was, unbound, unhidden, without anyone's expectations or anyone's plans for him shaping the space. It was the freest he had ever felt. It was also, he recognized, becoming addictive in a way he needed to be careful about, because the cloak was a tool and not a substitute for actually building the kind of life where he didn't need to hide to feel free. That was the project. That was what all the letters and the meetings and the legal strategy were for, underneath the practical necessity of them. Not revenge, not even justice exactly, though justice was involved, but the specific, fundamental thing of being allowed to be what he was without apology or concealment. He was going to build that. Piece by piece, meeting by meeting, letter by letter. He slept. Friday brought 2 replies. Sharpclaw confirmed Wednesday, enclosed the second exercises book, and noted with very dry goblin humor that the preliminary Longbottom account review had been upgraded to a full audit and that the results were, in his word, instructive. Lovegood replied the same day by a battered owl who delivered the letter with the air of an owl who had been through things and was unimpressed by anyone's drama. The reply was 2 pages, dense, written in a looping hand that suggested a man whose thoughts moved faster than his pen and who had made peace with that. It confirmed his interest, confirmed his independence. We have been attempting to publish a critical examination of Dumbledore's accumulation of institutional power for 3 years and have been refused advertising space in every other wizarding publication as a result, so yes, I understand the concept, and included, as a final line, the following: my daughter Looney, she insists on the nickname. I have given up, is 9 as well and would perhaps benefit from knowing another child currently engaged in dismantling the British magical establishment. She is unusual. I suspect you will not find this off-putting. Harry looked at this line for a moment, and then wrote back, I'll keep it in mind. Saturday. Florian Fortescue's, noon. He was there at 11:45, because he was always early to things he cared about and this was a thing he cared about, and he got ice cream, proper ice cream, a flavor he'd never had before called blackcurrant and honey that turned out to be extraordinary, and sat at an outside table in the mild June sun with his notes from the week and watched the alley. Remus Lupin arrived at exactly noon, and Harry recognized him immediately, not from any memory but from a kind of resonance, like recognizing a word in a language you haven't spoken in years. He was thin, in his early 30s, with the particular thinness of someone who ate adequately but whose body had other demands on it. There were lines in his face that were too early for his age, and his robes were clean but worn, the careful presentation of someone managing limited means with dignity. His eyes were gray-green and exhausted and, when they found Harry at the corner table, changed. Something in them shifted with a complicated and profound helplessness, the expression of someone finding something they'd thought lost and not knowing what to do with the finding. He crossed to the table. He sat down. He looked at Harry for a moment without speaking. Harry let him look. You have James's hair, Lupin said finally. His voice was low and slightly rough, like it needed use. And Lily's eyes. I know, Harry said. Sit properly. You look like you might tip over. Lupin blinked, and despite everything, the faintest ghost of something that had once been a very good smile moved at the corner of his mouth. He straightened. You wrote that you'd be at a table, he said. I didn't expect ice cream, Harry said. Do you want some? Yes, actually. A pause. Thank you. Harry flagged the server. Lupin ordered something vanilla, and seemed slightly undone by the simple act of someone offering him a normal thing without conditions. Your letter said you should have done more, Harry said, when the ice cream arrived. What stopped you? Lupin looked at his bowl. I believed Sirius was guilty. For longer than I should have. A pause. And after, when I knew he couldn't have been, when enough time had passed that I worked through what had actually happened, he stopped. I told myself I had nothing to offer you. That you were better placed with a family, with stability, even a Muggle family. I was in a cupboard, Harry said, without heat. Lupin closed his eyes briefly. I know. I know you know. I'm not saying it to punish you. Harry looked at him directly. I'm saying it because I want you to stop using it as a reason to keep feeling too guilty to be useful. What you did or didn't do 9 years ago isn't the conversation. The conversation is what you do now. Lupin opened his eyes. He looked at Harry with the same complicated expression as when he'd first arrived, but the helplessness had shifted into something less passive. What do you need? He asked. Right now. What you know, Harry said. About my parents. About Sirius. About what actually happened on October 31st. He paused. About Pettigrew. Something moved in Lupin's face at the name, an old and specific anger, the kind that had had years to become very quiet and very cold. Pettigrew was the secret keeper, Lupin said. Not Sirius. James and Lily switched at the last minute, Sirius's idea, thinking it would fool Voldemort if Sirius appeared to be the obvious choice. He paused. It was a good plan. Pettigrew ruined it. He looked at Harry. I believe he's alive. I've believed it for years, I can't prove it, but Peter he was a survivor, above all else. And a man who survived Hogwarts as a scrawny, average ability wizard by attaching himself to powerful friends doesn't go to a street in Muggle London and blow himself up. He paused. He fakes his death and runs. He's an animagus, Harry said. It wasn't a question. He'd pieced it together from his father's journal and the inheritance records that mentioned a group of friends who'd become unregistered animagi together. What form? Lupin looked at him carefully. How do you know about the animagi? My father's journal. I have it. He paused. What form? A pause. Rat. Harry thought about this. A rat. An unregistered animagus in rat form who, if alive, would most likely be living somewhere close to wizarding folk, somewhere he could hear news, monitor the situation, stay safe in a form no one would look twice at. The wizarding world was full of pet rats. Children kept them, students kept them, elderly witches kept them. He filed it. Not ready to action yet, but filed. I need you to write down everything you know about that night, Harry said. The full account. Verified by a magical oath if you're willing, nothing aggressive, just a standard truth bond for official purposes. It would strengthen Sirius's appeal enormously. Lupin looked at him across the table. You're really doing this, he said quietly. I've been doing it for over a week. You're 9. So everyone keeps telling me. Harry ate a spoonful of his ice cream. Will you write the account? Yes, Lupin said. I'll take any oath you need. A pause, and something in his voice shifted into territory that was clearly difficult for him. And I'd like to be involved, if that's, I understand if you don't want, you're third on my parents' guardianship list, Harry said. You were supposed to be around. You weren't. He paused. I'm not angry about that. I understand that there were forces larger than your personal choices. But if you're going to be in my life now, I need you to be in it, not hovering at the edge waiting to be told you're allowed. He looked at Lupin steadily. Can you do that? Lupin was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant a person was running up against the edge of something they've built around themselves for a very long time. Then he said, I'll try. Good enough, Harry said. They stayed another hour, and Lupin talked about his parents, stories, specific and detailed and real, the kind of things no letter or record could have given him. James with his absolute inability to let any injustice pass without comment. Lily's laugh, which had apparently been capable of restarting a stopped conversation by sheer force of warmth. The four of them, James, Lily, Sirius, Remus, as young men, as people in the full sense, not symbols or memories but individuals with habits and jokes and flaws. Harry listened with complete attention and filed everything, not for strategy but for the simpler and more fundamental reason that these were his parents and he had never had anyone tell him anything about them and it mattered in a way that had nothing to do with the case. When they left, Lupin stopped at the edge of the alley and said, quietly, I'll write the account tonight. Leave it with Gringotts, Harry said. Addressed to Sharpclaw. Lupin nodded. Then, with the specific awkwardness of someone who hasn't had many people to say goodbye to and isn't sure of the form, take care of yourself. I will, Harry said. You too. He walked back through the leaky cauldron and out into Muggle London with the sun on his face and Lupin's stories still warm in his chest like the ice cream, the blackcurrant and honey taste still faintly on his tongue, and he thought about everything that had been given back to him this week. Not by the ritual or the vault or the legal strategy but by this. A man who knew his father sitting across a table and talking about him as if he'd been real. As if Harry came from something real, from people who had been real, who had loved each other and been foolish and brave and alive before they weren't. He was still 9. He still had no formal magical education and no wand and approximately no standing in the wizarding world except the standing he was actively building from scratch in the middle of someone else's war. But he knew who he was now. That was new. That was the most important thing that had happened all week, and it hadn't been in any of the ledgers. Chapter 4, The Longbottom Mirror. Neville Longbottom arrived at Gringotts on Wednesday looking like someone who had been told they were going to the dentist and had spent the journey there constructing increasingly detailed reasons why it probably wouldn't hurt, and then had arrived and found out it probably would, actually, and was now operating on pure determination. Harry was waiting in the entrance hall when Augusta brought him through the main doors. He'd arrived 40 minutes early and spent the time with Brasscoin going over the updated petition. Dumbledore's counter-response had generated a counter-response which had generated a scheduling motion which had generated a counter-motion, and the whole thing was developing the particular bureaucratic density of a conflict being fought by extremely skilled people who all knew the same rulebook, and he'd only stopped when he heard the doors. Augusta swept in first, because Augusta always swept, with a quality of forward momentum that the entrance hall briefly reorganized itself around. She gave Harry a nod that was the Longbottom equivalent of a warm greeting. Neville came in 2 steps behind her and immediately tripped on the top step. He caught himself on the door frame, straightened up, and looked at Harry with the expression of someone taking an inventory of their remaining dignity and finding the results modest. "Good morning," Harry said, and didn't mention the trip. "Morning," Neville said, with the tone of someone who had provisionally declared war on Wednesday. Sharpclaw was waiting for them in the corridor, and he led them through to the ritual room, the same circular room with the black table and the room-carved walls where Harry had done his own ritual 12 days ago, and explained the process with the same steady, unhurried precision he'd used with Harry. Neville listened with his arms crossed tightly at his chest, not from hostility but from the specific posture of someone holding themselves together by conscious effort, and when Sharpclaw finished he looked at Harry. "Does it hurt?" "No," Harry said. "The ritual itself doesn't. What comes after can be uncomfortable, depending on what needs removing. But Sharpclaw and the healers are very good." Neville looked at Sharpclaw. "How long?" "The ritual, perhaps 20 minutes. What follows depends on what we find." Sharpclaw paused, which was a very deliberate goblin pause, the kind that meant the next sentence was important. "Whatever we find, Lord Longbottom, you will be told exactly and clearly. No omissions, no softening." Something about that specific promise, the bluntness of it, the implication that straight truth was a thing worth promising, visibly settled Neville. He uncrossed his arms. "All right. Let's do it." The blood drops hit the black bowl. Harry watched the results come up and kept his expression steady, because Augusta was watching him and because Neville deserved a room where people weren't performing reactions at him. But what the bowl showed was, it was worse than Harry's. Not in every way, but in one specific way that made his jaw tight. The bindings on Neville were the same signature, same construction, same general architecture as the 7 placed on Harry, but they had been placed more recently. Not at 18 months old. At 4. At 5. Some as late as 6 years old, layered over the earlier ones with the systematic patience of someone adjusting a mechanism that wasn't performing to specification. And the core suppressor on Neville was heavier, a fuller compression, reducing his expression to perhaps 15% rather than the fraction Harry had been working with, because, and Harry looked at the bowl and understood this with cold clarity, Dumbledore had decided Neville needed to be reduced more thoroughly. Not a weapon in reserve. A variable to be eliminated. Neville Longbottom had been assessed as a potential rival and systematically dismantled. Augusta saw it too. She was standing very still with her hands clasped at her waist, her face entirely composed, and only the absolute rigidity of her posture told Harry what the composure was costing her. "Gran," Neville said, quietly, looking at the bowl and then at her. "I see it," she said. That was all. Sharpclaw looked at Harry across the table, and Harry gave a fractional nod, and Sharpclaw said to Neville, would you like to proceed with the removal? Now. Neville looked slightly startled. Today. We have the full team present and prepared. A pause. There is no practical reason to delay, and some reasons not to. Neville thought about it for approximately 4 seconds, which Harry thought showed excellent decision-making speed given the circumstances. Yes. Now. They moved to the larger ritual room. Harry sat with Augusta in the adjacent waiting area, which was a small stone room with 2 chairs and a low table and absolutely nothing comforting about it except for a carafe of water and 2 cups, which was enough. Augusta poured water for both of them without asking and sat with a straightness that was almost architectural, and they were quiet for a while in the specific way of 2 people who are in the middle of something large and have temporarily run out of immediate action. He was 4, Augusta said, eventually. Not a question. Yes. 4 years old, and Albus Dumbledore sat across from him at Christmas dinner. He came every Christmas, Mr. Potter. For years, he was always present at these things. That was how he worked. He was always present and always generous and always the first person in the room to say the right thing. Albus Dumbledore sat across from my 4-year-old grandson and had already put bindings on him. She paused. At Christmas dinner he told me that magical development in children was unpredictable and not to put too much pressure on Neville, that boys developed at their own pace. She looked at the closed ritual room door. He was so kind about it. Harry thought about Dumbledore's visit to St. Mungo's, and the line Augusta had quoted at their first meeting, "Some things have to cost what they cost." He thought about a man who moved through other people's lives arranging pieces and calling it care. He made you comfortable with the problem he created, Harry said. Yes. A pause. That is an extremely sophisticated kind of cruelty. He doesn't think of it as cruelty, Harry said. That's the most important thing to understand about him. He thinks it's necessary management. Augusta looked at him. Does that make it better or worse? Worse, Harry said. Cruelty can be argued with. Necessity is harder. Augusta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The 2 Wizengamot members I mentioned. I have spoken with them." She set her water cup down precisely. Lord Greengrass and Lady Bones. Both have concerns about Dumbledore's influence on the ministry that predate your petition. Lady Bones in particular, she has been in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement for 12 years and she has had questions about Sirius Black's case for most of them. A pause. She will not join the petition without more evidence. But she will not oppose it either, and she is willing to receive documentation directly from Gringotts. That's enough, Harry said. For now. He thought. What about the scheduling of the Wizengamot panel? Dumbledore filed a motion to delay on grounds that 30 days was insufficient time for adequate representation. Gringotts countered that the delay provision only applies when the petitioner is at risk from a delay, and I'm not at risk from a 30-day hearing, I'm at risk from a longer timeline. I saw the filings, Augusta said. The panel ruling on the delay motion is expected Friday. She paused. I know 2 of the 7 panel members personally. I have said nothing to them about the case, that would be inappropriate, but I know them. Pringle is a formalist, he will go by the letter of the procedure, and the letter of the procedure does not support Dumbledore's delay motion. Vance will be influenced by the Charter of Magical Rights argument because she was on the committee that drafted the current revision. She paused. That's 2 of 7 who are likely to rule against the delay. You need 4. What about the other 5? Unknown quantities. Except for 1. She paused, and for the first time in Harry's experience, Augusta Longbottom looked slightly as though she'd tasted something she'd rather not have. Cornelius Fudge. He was placed on the panel by lot, which is genuine, but Fudge has been positioning himself for the Minister for Magic appointment for 3 years and Dumbledore's support is valuable, Harry finished. He will vote to delay, Augusta said. Which means you need 4 of the remaining 6. She looked at Harry. What's your read of the Gringotts legal team's confidence? Brass Coin told me yesterday that the delay motion is weak and he would eat his hat if it succeeded, Harry said. He doesn't wear a hat. I think it was metaphorical. Augusta's mouth did something that was technically not a smile but occupied the same general space. Brass Coin has been practicing Wisengamot law for 40 years. I take his metaphors seriously. They were quiet again. From behind the closed door came no sound. Goblin ritual work was characteristically silent, but Harry could feel it, the distant signature of significant magical work being done carefully, and something underneath that, a pressure gradually easing, like a held note finally being released. His parents, Harry said, after a while. Not a question, just a step. Frank and Alice, Augusta said. Her voice was entirely level and entirely empty of inflection, the way a thing is when a person has said it so many times in so many contexts that emotion has been worn away from the outside while remaining absolutely intact underneath. I take him to St. Mungo's every month. He draws pictures for them. Alice takes the wrappers from the Drubble's best blowing gum they give her and keeps collecting them, she saves them up and gives them to him. She doesn't know who he is anymore. A pause. He knows who she is. Harry said nothing. There wasn't anything to say to that. He let it be what it was. The Death Eaters who attacked them are in Azkaban, Augusta said. The Lestranges and Bartemius Crouch Jr. I attended all 3 trials. Dumbledore presided. She paused. For a long time I was grateful for that. For the efficiency and the certainty of the convictions. It felt like justice. Another pause, and this one had a different quality. I am now revising my understanding of what I was watching. Harry looked at her. Crouch Sr. signed Black's Azkaban order, Augusta said. His own son was convicted of attacking my son. Both orders issued through Dumbledore's court. Both men in Azkaban without, or in Sirius's case, without any, proper trial. She looked at Harry directly. I am asking you a question that you do not have to answer. Was Dumbledore ensuring that certain people stayed in Azkaban because they deserved to be there, or because they knew things he needed to stay buried? The question was the sharpest thing Augusta Longbottom had said since he'd met her, and she had said quite a few sharp things. I think, Harry said carefully, that both things can be true at once. The Lestranges and Crouch Jr. probably deserved exactly what they got. The question is whether Sirius's imprisonment was incidental to that or structural. He paused. If Pettigrew is alive, and I think he is, then Sirius being in Azkaban is the thing preventing anyone from looking too hard for Pettigrew, because Pettigrew being alive means Sirius didn't do what he was imprisoned for, and Sirius being free and exonerated means everyone starts asking questions about who authorized the irregular imprisonment. He paused. Including Dumbledore. Augusta absorbed this. So Sirius in Azkaban is a weight that keeps an entire structure of inconvenient questions underwater. Yes. Then getting Sirius out does more than free one man. It pulls the weight, Harry said. And everything that was held down by it comes up. Augusta looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, in a tone that had a quality Harry recognized as close to approval, how old did you say you were? 9. Your parents would be, she stopped. Recalibrated. James Potter was always too loud and too certain about things. Lily Evans was the most structurally sound mind I encountered in 30 years on the Wisengamot, which she never joined because she was killed at 21. She paused. I'm glad you got her brain. I think I got some of both, Harry said. Good. Augusta picked up her water cup again. That will be necessary. The ritual room door opened 2 hours and 20 minutes after they'd gone in, and Neville came out first. He looked different. Not physically, not in any way that a stranger would notice, same round face, same brown eyes, same slightly too large robes. But he was standing differently. Not straighter, exactly, it was more fundamental than posture. He was standing like a person who has just discovered that the floor they've been walking on their whole life was actually 6 inches above the real floor, and they've just touched down on the real floor for the first time. He looked at Harry and said, "Oh. Yeah," Harry said. Neville looked at his hands. Nothing was visibly happening, but something in the air near him had changed, the particular quality of a powerful magical presence no longer compressed out of existence. "It's like, too loud," Harry said. "In a room you've been whispering in." Neville laughed, and this time it was different from the small surprised laugh in the Longbottom sitting room. It was full and real and slightly overwhelmed, the laugh of someone finding out a thing is better than they dared hope. "Yes. Exactly, yes." Augusta stepped forward and put one hand briefly on Neville's shoulder, a gesture that was for Augusta approximately equivalent to anyone else bursting into tears, and Neville leaned into it for just a moment. Sharpclaw appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of a goblin who had just done something technically demanding and was allowing himself a fractional satisfaction. "The results match yours," he said to Harry. "Same signature. Earlier placement, heavier core suppressor, comparable financial redirectors." He paused. "There are some additional elements in Neville's case that I would like to review with you privately." Harry nodded. "Give Neville the exercises book first." Sharpclaw produced it without needing to be asked. He'd prepared a copy, as Harry had requested, and handed it to Neville with a brief, precise explanation of the method. Neville took it with both hands and the expression of someone receiving something important, which he was. The additional elements, when Sharpclaw explained them, were ones Harry hadn't anticipated. There was a fourth binding on Neville that had no equivalent in Harry's case. It was not a suppressor or a redirector, it was a compulsion. Subtle, deeply embedded, shaped to influence rather than direct, specifically targeted at Neville's self-assessment, his confidence in his own magical ability, his willingness to trust his own instincts, his fundamental belief in his own worth as a magical person. It had been placed when Neville was 5. It had been running for 4 years. A compulsion to believe himself incompetent, Harry said flatly. A compulsion to accept inadequacy as natural, Sharpclaw corrected, which was worse because it was more precise. It would not have made him behave in a way that was obviously unnatural. It would simply have made every accidental self-doubt feel certain. Every moment of difficulty feel definitive. Was it removed with the others? Yes. The healers caught it in the third pass. Neville may not notice its absence immediately, compulsions of that type leave residual patterns that the mind has to relearn around. He paused. The exercises will help. Harry sat with this for a moment. Dumbledore had not only bound Neville's magic, had not only drained his family's wealth, had not only positioned him as a discarded alternate. He had taken active steps to make Neville believe his own diminishment was real. Had reached into a 5-year-old boy's self-concept and carved out the parts that would have told him something was wrong. "Document everything," Harry said. "Full healer's report, specific notation on the compulsion, magical signature confirmed." He paused. "That's the piece that's going to matter most in the Wizengamot. People can debate whether core suppressors are protective. Nobody defends a compulsion targeting a child's self-worth." "Already being drafted," Sharpclaw said. They left Gringotts at 2:30, Augusta and Neville, and Harry walked them to the alley entrance and stood for a moment in the mild afternoon sun. Neville had been quiet since the waiting room, a different kind of quiet from his pre-ritual silence, not compressed but full, the quiet of someone processing a very large thing. At the entrance Neville stopped and turned. "Harry." "Yeah. When this is over. When the petition's done and everything's sorted." He paused. "What happens? To you, I mean." "Where do you, I'm working on that," Harry said. "But you'll still," Neville stopped, then tried again with the particular directness that was, Harry was coming to understand, Neville's natural mode when he wasn't being compressed. "You're not going to just do all of this and then disappear." "No," Harry said. "I'm not going to disappear." Neville nodded, and it was such a specifically relieved nod that Harry understood something. whatever Neville had or hadn't had in his life, the category of people who showed up and stayed was not one he had a lot of experience with either. They were different temperaments, different approaches, different everything, but they were the same shape, underneath. Both of them had been told, in various elaborate ways, that they were less than they were. Both of them were finding out that wasn't true. Both of them were going to have to build something new in the space where that lie used to be. Wednesday next week, Harry said. Bring those notes on the Wizengamot procedures. We're going to need them. Neville's chin came up slightly, and for a fraction of a second Harry saw it again, what Neville was going to look like at full capacity. I'll add to them, he said. Augusta swept through the entrance with the self-assurance of someone who moved through London on permanent right-of-way, and Neville followed, and Harry watched them go and then turned back into the alley. Friday brought the panel ruling. Harry was in the Gringotts legal office when the official notification arrived, hand-delivered by a Wizengamot clerk with the slightly harassed look of someone who'd been busy. Brasscoin opened it, read it, and placed it flat on the table with a gesture that managed to be simultaneously very controlled and very satisfied. The delay motion was denied 5-2. Dumbledore's representation would have 30 days from the original filing to prepare responses to all petition counts. The full Wizengamot panel hearing was scheduled accordingly. Fudge voted for the delay, Brasscoin said, without looking up. Obviously, Harry said. Who was the second? Avery. Death Eater sympathizer, minister positioned, predictable. Brasscoin made a note. The 5 votes against included Pringle and Vance as expected, and 3 others who are, for now, unaligned but reading the evidence clearly. Good. Harry looked at the notification. The hearing was 7 weeks away. 7 weeks of Dumbledore's team preparing their defense, 7 weeks of their own preparation, 7 weeks in which things could move considerably in any direction. We need everything airtight before the hearing. Every document certified, every witness account truth-bound, every financial record cross-referenced against the redirector binding evidence. We know, Brasscoin said, with the tone of a man who has been doing this for 40 years and does not require instruction. But not unkindly. Harry spent Friday afternoon in the legal library Gringotts had given him access to, a small room off the main corridor with 3 walls of shelves and a desk that was apparently his for as long as he needed it, going through the counter-response documents and Neville's ritual report and making notes. His magical exercises had shifted, over the past week, from simple containment into something more explorative. Sharpclaw had advanced him past the first section of the Grey Book and into the second, which dealt with active channeling, and Harry had taken to it the way he took to most things that made fundamental sense, immediately and completely. He didn't have a wand. He'd thought about this, had been thinking about it increasingly as his core expanded and the magic in him became more thoroughly and comfortably his, and decided, after reading the relevant sections of the Potter family history and 2 books on wandless magic history that he'd found in the vault, that he was going to hold off. Not because he couldn't wield a wand, he was extremely confident he could, possibly rather too powerfully, but because getting a wand meant a Ollivander visit, and Ollivander had an extraordinary memory and a well-documented relationship with Dumbledore, and Harry was not yet ready to announce his presence to everyone who would inevitably be informed. What he had discovered, in the quiet of late nights with his magic fully present and expanding steadily, was that he didn't need a wand for the things he currently needed to do. His magic responded to intent and focus with a directness that was, he suspected, related to the Archon-level classification Sharpclaw had mentioned, and the goblin structural exercises gave him a framework for channeling it precisely. He could move objects. He could produce light. He could, with more effort, produce heat and cold. He'd accidentally produced a localized thunderclap in the Gringotts library Tuesday morning when he'd been reading something that made him very angry and hadn't been paying attention to his containment, and Brasscoin had appeared in the doorway with a look of resigned unsurprise that suggested this was not the first time a Lord Potter had made weather in the legal library. Saturday brought Lupin again, not by arrangement but by letter, a short one, hand-delivered to Gringotts, asking if Harry was available. He was, and they met at Fortescue's again, and this time Lupin looked marginally less like a man trying to survive the experience of his own guilt, which was progress. He brought the sworn account, 12 pages, detailed, covering the weeks before October 31st through to his own discovery of events the following day. It was truth-bound with a standard Wisingamot admissible oath, witnessed by Sharpclaw, and when Harry read it in Lupin's presence it was like having the outline he'd already understood filled in with color and substance. The last few pages, Lupin arriving at Godric's Hollow, finding the house, Harry read steadily and didn't let the thing he felt at those pages show in his face, because Lupin was watching him and Lupin was visibly very close to the edge of something, and Harry didn't want to tip him over. "This is exactly what we needed," Harry said, when he'd finished. "Thank you." Lupin stopped. "Don't thank me for this. It's 12 years late." 11, Harry said. 12 in October. He paused. "But I'm not counting. The point is it exists now and it's going to be used." He set the account carefully in the folder he'd brought. "Can you do something else for me?" "Yes. When the hearing happens, in 7 weeks, I need people in that room who knew my parents. Who can speak to Sirius's character, to the nature of their group, to what the actual chain of trust was in the days before they died. The Wisingamot will have Dumbledore's version of events. I need the real version from people who were there." He looked at Lupin. "I know you're not, I know public appearances are complicated for you." Lupin was quiet for a moment. His condition, which Harry had found in the Potter family records and had not brought up because he was waiting for Lupin to choose to, was a thing that cost him something. Harry could see, in every room he entered, the constant low-level management of a life that the wizarding world had decided was lesser. "I'll be there," Lupin said. "Whatever the cost." He paused. "There's someone else you should speak to. Arabella Figg." Harry had heard the name, a woman on Privet Drive, a squib who occasionally kept him when the Dursleys went out. "Mrs. Figg? She has been watching you for years. Reporting to Dumbledore." Lupin looked at his hands. She cares about you. Whatever her arrangement with Dumbledore, she did not like what she saw. She's told me so, recently. She would testify about conditions at Privet Drive if you needed. Harry thought about Mrs. Figg's house, the smell of cats, the slide shows of her cats, the weak tea, the way she always fed him properly when he was there, slipping him biscuits and actual meals with the guilty care of someone who knew what the alternative was. He thought about how she'd always been a bit too casual about what he said, a bit too unfocused in her questions, the quality of someone listening for specifics while performing disinterest. "She reported to Dumbledore," he said. "Yes. She was conflicted about it, and Lupin paused. "She's done now. She told me last week. She found out about the petition and she rang me. She has a phone." Harry said, distracted. "She's a squib who lives in a Muggle neighborhood," Lupin said. "Yes, she has a phone." Harry thought. Mrs. Figg's testimony would corroborate the living conditions at Privet Drive, the cupboard, the food situation, the social isolation, and connect them directly to Dumbledore's knowing placement. It was the human element, the one that made it impossible to claim that the illegal guardianship had been administered with Harry's welfare in mind. "I'll talk to her," he said. "This week, before she changes her mind." They talked for another hour, easier this time, the conversation finding a more natural current, Lupin telling more stories when Harry asked, asking careful questions when Harry described the current state of the petition, listening in the steady attentive way of someone who took other people's words seriously. At some point the conversation shifted from strategy to something more ordinary, Lupin asking about the goblin exercises, Harry describing the Tuesday thunderclap incident, Lupin's expression moving through startled, concerned, and helplessly amused in quick succession. "Your father once accidentally turned his bedroom ceiling into a skylight," Lupin offered. "When he was doing early wandless experiments. It was January. Did it snow in the room?" "Only a little." Harry laughed, a proper one, the full version, the one that had been happening more frequently over the past 2 weeks as if it were a capacity gradually being unlocked alongside everything else. Lupin looked at him when he laughed, the same complicated expression as always but with less helplessness and more something Harry didn't yet have a word for, something quiet and specific and warm. He would have been he and Lily both would have been, Lupin stopped, because this was a sentence that didn't have a good ending, and he knew it. "I'm glad you're here," he said instead. "I'm glad you came to Gringotts." "So am I," Harry said. He visited Mrs. Figg on Sunday. She opened the door before he knocked, which answered the question of whether she'd been expecting him. She was a small woman in her 60s, with grey hair and the perpetually slightly worried expression that Harry had always read as absent-mindedness and now understood differently. She had 2 cats around her feet immediately and her house smelled exactly as it always had, and she stood back to let him in without speaking. He sat at her kitchen table. She made tea, proper tea, the good kind she always made him, and sat across from him and looked at him the way you look at something you have a complicated relationship with. "You know why I'm here," Harry said. "Yes." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I'm not going to make excuses for it. I'm more actions request aborted write the next chapter now." Chapter 5, Lord Potter speaks. The Wizengamot chamber was older than most of the people who sat in it, and it knew it. Harry had read about it in the family history, the tiered seating, the stone walls, the specific acoustics designed to make sure everyone could hear and no one could whisper without being noticed, but reading about a thing and standing in it were categorically different experiences, and he stood in the antechamber outside the main doors and felt the weight of the place through the wall with the particular clarity of a magical core that was no longer compressed into silence. 7 weeks since the petition filing. 7 weeks of documentation and counterfilings and truth-bound accounts and financial cross-referencing and a level of legal preparation that Brasscoin had described, with quiet goblin satisfaction, as the most comprehensively built petition he had encountered in 4 decades of practice. 7 weeks of Dumbledore's legal team filing motions and having them denied, requesting extensions and being refused, attempting 3 separate procedural challenges and losing all 3. 7 weeks, and now here. Harry was 10. Had been, for 3 weeks, since his birthday had arrived quietly in the Gringotts secured safe house where he'd been living since the end of June, a proper set of rooms in a building that had no Muggle address and no visible entrance from the street, maintained by goblin wards that were several centuries more sophisticated than anything the Ministry could field. He'd spent his birthday morning doing exercises on the roof, where he could be outside with his magic fully present and no neighbors to worry about, and Lupin had come at noon and brought a cake, chocolate, slightly lopsided, clearly made rather than bought, which Harry appreciated more than the other kind, and Neville had come with Augusta at 2, and they'd had the specific awkward warmth of people who were new to being a chosen family and were working out the form of it, and it had been genuinely the best day Harry could remember having. He'd also, on his birthday morning, sent a letter to Dumbledore. Short. Direct. Precise. Lord Dumbledore, I understand you will be present at the Wizengamot hearing in 3 weeks. I wanted you to know, before you prepare your arguments, that I have read your counter-response carefully and I found it creative. I also want you to know that I have my parents' will, Gringotts' full forensic analysis of the 7 bindings, the complete financial audit of the redirector destinations, 3 truth-bound witness accounts, and the ritual reports for both myself and Neville Longbottom. If you would like to resolve this before the hearing through a formal settlement, my representation will receive your offer. Otherwise I will see you in the chamber. Harry J. Potter, Lord Potter. He had not sent it to provoke. He had sent it because he wanted Dumbledore to walk into that chamber knowing Harry knew exactly what he had, not discovering it in real time and having the theater of reaction available to him. Strip the surprise. Take away the room for improvisation. Make Dumbledore prepare for a specific known threat rather than an uncertain one, because a mind as good as Dumbledore's was more dangerous when improvising than when executing a prepared defense, and a prepared defense had fixed edges you could work around. Dumbledore had not responded to the letter, which told Harry that he intended to fight. Which was fine. Harry had built exactly for that. Sharpclaw appeared at his shoulder. They're ready for us. How does the chamber feel? Harry asked. Sharpclaw considered this, goblins took experiential questions seriously, didn't dismiss them as subjective. Tense. 41 members present plus the panel. Dumbledore is in his seat, which he technically should not be occupying given his recusal from this matter, but he has positioned himself as an observer rather than a presiding member, and that argument will be tested. A pause. Lady Bones is present and she has been speaking to people for the last 20 minutes. That is a good sign. Another pause. There are journalists in the gallery. Which ones? The Prophet has a correspondent. Several independents. And Xenophilius Lovegood. Sharpclaw's tone on the last name carried no judgment, just information. Harry had been in contact with Lovegood for 3 weeks, a correspondence that had evolved from cautious establishment of mutual interest into something more substantive. Lovegood had read every piece of documentation Harry had authorized him to see and had, in response, sent back a letter 12 pages long full of the most incisive political analysis Harry had encountered outside of Augusta's sitting room. He wasn't planning to publish anything today, they'd agreed on timing, on what would come first through official channels, but his presence in the gallery mattered. It said to Dumbledore, "There is someone here who is not on your side, who is watching everything, who will write what actually happened rather than what you would prefer happened." Neville was in the gallery too, with Augusta. She was taking her Wizengamot seat on the floor, and Neville was watching from above, and Harry had felt him that morning in the way he was developing, an awareness of the people who mattered to him, a kind of low background note like a familiar chord. Neville had been a revelation over the past 7 weeks. Unbound and given the exercises and working steadily, he was turning into something remarkable, still careful, still more thoughtful than instinctive, but with a core that was deep and steady in his own, and a mind that was, when applied to something it cared about, formidably precise. He'd been applying it to Wizengamot procedure, and had given Harry 3 strategic notes in the last week that had each been incorporated into Brascoign's approach. Lupin was in the gallery. Harry had felt him before he saw him, the particular quality of Lupin's presence, which had become familiar over 7 weeks of Saturday meetings and occasional unscheduled visits, the warm steady grey of it. He was sitting very straight and looking at the chamber doors with an expression of focused determination, and Harry thought, that's what he looked like before Azkaban. That's the version of himself he's been finding his way back to. Mrs. Figg's sworn statement was in the documentation package. She had not been able to come today. She'd written to say that entering the ministry building would be beyond her, that the wards there reacted to squibs in a way she found intolerable, that she was sorry, and Harry had written back that it was completely fine and he had what she'd given him and it was enough. He'd meant it. He was ready. Everything was ready. "Let's go in," he said to Sharpclaw. The chamber doors opened. He walked in. The tiered seating was indeed exactly as described, 41 members in dark purple robes arranged in a curved arc around the central floor, the panel of 7 at a separate elevated bench to the left, the chief warlock's seat at the top center currently empty because Dumbledore had correctly recused from presiding and they had a deputy presiding today, a witch named Marchbanks whom Harry recognized from the family history as rigidly impartial and technically brilliant. Dumbledore was in a member's seat to the right. He was watching Harry walk in with an expression that was very carefully calibrated, not surprised, not defensive, composed in the specific way of someone who has decided in advance what expression to wear and is wearing it with full commitment. He looked, and Harry catalogued this with the part of his mind that ran assessments without interrupting the rest of him, like a man who was engaged in this process, who respected it, who was confident in his position. It was an extremely good performance. The blue eyes were steady and the long silver beard was arranged and the half-moon glasses caught the chamber's light, and he looked like the most trustworthy man in the room. He also looked at Harry with something beneath the performance that was more real, a flash of genuine assessment, quick and sharp and entirely concealed from anyone who wasn't paying very close attention. The look of a man recalibrating. Harry had not been expected to walk in like this, with this bearing, this certainty, this presence. Dumbledore had expected, Harry understood, some version of what he'd built, a boy reduced and uncertain, possibly angry, possibly frightened, potentially easy to manage once the legal noise died down. He got Harry looking directly back at him across the chamber floor and not blinking. Dumbledore held his gaze for a moment and then looked away to the panel bench, and Harry thought, there it is. There's the first thing. Harry sat at the petitioner's table with Brasscoin and Sharpclaw on either side. The documentation package was in 3 copies, already distributed to the panel and to the designated members. He folded his hands on the table and waited for the proceedings to begin. Deputy Presider Marchbanks opened the session with the formulaic language of Wisengamot procedure, which Harry had memorized and found soothing in its rhythm, the specific comfort of a structure you understood operating the way it was supposed to operate. Petition case reference. Parties present. The nature of the counts. The procedural history, including the denied delay motion, which Marchbanks read aloud with the same neutral tone she gave everything, but Harry noticed 2 of the panel members shift slightly when the denial was mentioned and the motion's denying vote count repeated. The petitioner may present, Marchbanks said. Brasscoin stood. Harry had watched Brasscoin prepare for 2 weeks and had never quite been able to predict what the goblin looked like in actual operation until now. He was extraordinary, precise, unhurried, with the particular authority of someone who had stood in this room many times and had no anxiety about it, only the clean focused energy of doing something he was very good at. He took the counts in order, and he was not dramatic about it, not theatrical, and that was what made it effective. He presented each piece of evidence with the specific gravity of things that were simply true and required no embellishment. The heritage ritual results. The forensic analysis of the 7 bindings. The magical signature evidence, and here Brasscoin set the full signature report on the record, read the signature aloud in the formal notation, and then said, with the same even tone, that this signature had been cross-referenced against the Ministry's own magical registration records and confirmed as belonging to Albus Dumbledore, and the chamber changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The way a room changes when something true enters it, a slight shift in the air, a quality of attention becoming more absolute. The financial records. The redirector binding evidence. The trust account destination. The accounting of what had been taken. The will. When Brasscoin produced the will, the certified Gringotts copy, seal and attestation clearly visible from the gallery, he read aloud the specific passage, the named guardians, in order, none of whom was Albus Dumbledore. He paused after reading it, not for effect but because the procedure required a pause for member notation, and in that pause the chamber was very quiet indeed. The petitioner respectfully notes, Brasscoin said, into that quiet, that the counter-response filed by the respondent's representation makes extensive reference to emergency wartime guardianship provisions. The petitioner further notes that those provisions, as written in the Charter Revision of 1947, specifically and explicitly require that emergency guardianship designation be offered first to parties named in the deceased's will, if one exists, before any external appointment can be made. No such offer was made to Sirius Black, to Frank and Alice Longbottom, or to Remus Lupin. He paused again. The emergency provision was not used. It was misrepresented. Someone in the member seating made a sound. Harry didn't look to see who, he was watching the panel, specifically the 5 faces he needed, tracking the quality of their attention. Pringle, the formalist, was writing rapidly. Good. Vance, the charter advocate, was looking at the will copy with an expression of contained fury. Very good. The 3 unaligned members, all 3 were watching Brasscoin with the focused attention of people doing serious recalculation. Fudge was writing too, but differently, the writing of someone composing a response rather than recording. Harry noted this and set it aside. Brasscoin moved to the Neville Longbottom evidence, the second ritual report, the healer's documentation, and critically, the compulsion binding report. He was careful here, as they'd planned, building to it rather than leading with it, establishing the pattern first. Same signature. Same methodology. A second child, a second set of illegal bindings, placed on a sitting member's grandson with the same deliberate architecture as those placed on the petitioner. The compulsion binding, Brasscoin said, and his voice dropped half a register, not from drama but from the specific gravity of what he was about to say, was placed on Neville Longbottom at the age of 5. Its structure and purpose are documented in the attached Healer's Report, Exhibit 17. To summarize that report for the record, the binding was designed to cause the subject to experience natural self-doubt as external certainty. To make the subject believe, with the emotional conviction of his own inner voice, that he was magically inferior. To prevent him from questioning this belief, he set the document down. It is not a suppressor. It is not a redirector. It is a binding designed to inhabit a child's sense of himself and rot it from the inside, so gradually and so thoroughly that the child would never know it was there. He paused. The respondent placed this binding on a 5-year-old boy. Augusta Longbottom, in her member's seat, was sitting with the absolute rigid stillness of a woman who had made a decision about her composure and was keeping it through something that looked like pure structural will. Harry glanced at her once. She was looking at the panel bench and not at Dumbledore, and he thought, she's made her decision. She's here all the way. Brasscoin concluded with the witness accounts, summarized, not read in full, with full copies in the documentation package. Lupin's truth-bound account of October 31st and the following days. Mrs. Figg's sworn statement regarding conditions at Privet Drive. 3 other brief statements from people in Harry's life whose testimony corroborated specific aspects of the case, a Muggle librarian who had noticed and documented Harry's visits over 6 years in a way that inadvertently created a record of his solitary life, and 2 wizarding folk who had independently observed aspects of the Dursley situation through adjacent means. The petitioner rests, Brasscoin said, and sat. The respondent's representation was a wizard named Percival Thorne, tall, silver-haired, with the particular quality of someone who was extremely expensive and knew it. He was a ministry-affiliated barrister of considerable reputation, and Harry had read his previous cases and had a clear understanding of his methods. He was strongest at rehabilitation of narrative, at finding the sympathetic reframe, at turning documented facts into evidence of good intentions poorly executed. He was going to need those skills today. Thorne stood and presented, and it was very good, Harry admitted honestly to himself. Thorne was excellent at this. He acknowledged each piece of evidence directly, which was the right call, and for each one he offered a counter-narrative that was internally consistent and built from real pieces of Dumbledore's history. The protective intent argument. The extraordinary circumstances argument. The absence of any comparable framework for the situation Dumbledore faced in 1981, a child who was the living focus of the most powerful dark magic in living memory, who required management beyond any ordinary understanding. He framed Dumbledore not as a man who had acted for personal benefit but as a man who had acted, perhaps imperfectly, perhaps beyond his authority, but with the singular purpose of protecting the wizarding world. He addressed the will directly, acknowledged the oversight, called it exactly that, an oversight in the chaos of wartime, and argued that the intent of the emergency provision was clearly served even if the letter of it had not been followed. He did not address the compulsion binding. Harry noticed this immediately. Thorne had addressed every other count, had reframed every other piece of evidence, had not mentioned the compulsion binding placed on Neville once in 45 minutes of presentation. Because there was no reframe for it. Because it was the one piece of evidence that was simply what it was, with no available counter-narrative, no sympathetic reading, no way to say it had been done for anyone's good. You could argue about core suppressors and emergency powers and difficult decisions. You could not make a 5-year-old's targeted compulsion towards self-belief in their own inadequacy look like anything other than what it was. Thorne knew it. He'd cut it from his argument entirely and was hoping the panel would let it pass. Harry touched Brasscoin's arm. The goblin glanced at him. Harry nodded toward the documentation package, toward Exhibit 17's tab, which Brasscoin had marked with a small iron clip. Brasscoin gave him a fractional nod back. When Thorne sat, Marchbanks said, "The petitioner has right of brief response to the respondent's presentation." Brasscoin stood and said, in 4 precise sentences, that the respondent's presentation had failed to address Count 4, the compulsion binding, in its entirety, that no counter-evidence or alternative explanation had been offered, and that in the absence of any response whatsoever, the panel should consider the count uncontested. He sat. Thorn was already standing. The respondent requests. The respondent had 45 minutes of uninterrupted presentation, Marchbank said, with the specific tone of a woman who had been applying procedural rules for 50 years and found attempted circumvention mildly tedious. Sit down, Mr. Thorn. The panel withdrew to deliberate. Harry sat at the petitioner's table while the chamber moved around him, members speaking in low voices, the hum of 41 people processing a thing that had significantly complicated their understanding of their world. He felt Dumbledore's presence in the room with the peripheral clarity that his expanded core gave him, a weighty gold-and-silver pressure that was, undeniably, formidable. Dumbledore's magic was the real thing, old and deep and serious, and Harry didn't underestimate it. Dumbledore was looking at him. Harry turned and met the look directly. The blue eyes were unreadable in the way that very skilled minds are unreadable, not blank but full, controlled, the expression of someone running a great deal of internal process while showing nothing. But Harry had the particular advantage of having spent his entire life reading the emotions people were hiding rather than the ones they were showing, and what he read in Dumbledore's face, beneath the composure and the assessment, was something he hadn't expected. Not anger. Not calculation. Something quieter and more complicated. Something like grief. Dumbledore looked at Harry the way someone looks at an outcome they had designed specifically to avoid, and Harry held the gaze and thought, "You thought this would never happen. Not because you believed the bindings would hold forever, you're too smart for that, but because you believed by the time any of this was possible, it would be too late for it to matter. You believed I would arrive at Hogwarts already shaped. Already yours." Harry looked at him for a long moment, and then looked away, because there was nothing more to communicate, and he'd said what needed saying. The panel returned after 22 minutes, which was fast. Marchbanks read the findings. Count 1, irregular assumption of guardianship without legal appointment, sustained. The will was entered as definitive evidence. The emergency provision had not been properly applied. Dumbledore's guardianship was declared void retroactively from the date of appointment. Count 2, financial malfeasance, specifically unauthorized redirection of the Potter estate assets, sustained. The full audit was accepted as evidence. Restitution to be calculated and ordered separately. Count 3, violation of the Charter of Magical Rights, Article 9, core suppression of a minor, sustained. Both Potter and Longbottom ritual reports accepted. Dumbledore's actions found to constitute deliberate violation of the Charter's most fundamental protection. Count 4, compulsion binding placed on Neville Longbottom, sustained. Uncontested. No counter-evidence offered by the respondent. Count 5, infliction of dark magical bindings constituting assault, referred. This last word landed differently from the others. Marchbanks explained, Count 5, the killing curse variance, was of sufficient seriousness to require referral to a full criminal panel rather than a civil Wisengamot hearing. The findings from the civil hearing were to be transferred to the Auror office for investigation and the convening of a formal criminal inquiry. The chamber was very quiet. Then, with the specific procedural efficiency of the Wisengamot at its functional best, Marchbanks moved immediately to the related matter of Sirius Black. This had been a strategic decision made by Brasscoin and Harry together, 2 weeks ago, file the emergency review application for Sirius's imprisonment as a connected matter to the main petition, so it could be heard in the same session rather than requiring a separate filing. Lupin's truth-bound account established that Sirius had not been the Potter's secret keeper. The irregular Azkaban order, co-signed by Dumbledore, when placed against the civil findings just recorded, the established pattern of Dumbledore removing individuals who complicated his arrangements, created a picture that the panel had, apparently, been looking at during their deliberations. The emergency review application for Sirius Orion Black's imprisonment was heard for 11 minutes. The evidence was brief and devastating: no trial on record, emergency order with no subsequent review, Lupin's account of the actual secret keeper arrangement, and the corroborating fact that Peter Pettigrew, the alleged murder victim, had no confirmed death in the Gringotts registry. The panel suspended Sirius Black's imprisonment pending a full retrial. Pending meant today. Pending meant the order was sent to Azkaban before the session closed. Pending meant Sirius Black was leaving Azkaban tonight. There was noise in the chamber now, the genuine unrehearsed noise of 41 witches and wizards processing a cascade of implications, and in the gallery Harry heard but didn't look at the particular sound of Lupin making a sound he'd probably been holding in for 11 years. Harry sat at the petitioner's table and kept his face steady and his hands flat and his breathing even, and inside his chest his magic was moving like something had just opened a window. Marchbanks called the chamber to order. There were 2 additional items, she said, and she read them with the same unhurried precision she'd brought to everything. First, the findings were to be published in full in the Wizengamot official record, which was a public document, accessible to the wizarding press. There would be no summary, no redaction, no editorial framing from the ministry, the findings as written. Second, Albus Dumbledore, in light of the civil findings recorded today, was temporarily suspended from his position as Chief Warlock pending the criminal investigation into Count 5, by a standard provision that prohibited anyone under active criminal inquiry from presiding over the body conducting that inquiry. Cornelius Fudge stood up. Deputy Presider, with respect, the provision is automatic, Mr. Fudge, Marchbanks said. It does not require a vote. Sit down. Fudge sat down. Harry looked at Dumbledore. He was sitting with perfect stillness and his hands folded and his face entirely composed, and he was looking at Marchbanks, not at Harry. He accepted the findings and the suspension with a grace that was, Harry recognized, entirely genuine. Dumbledore understood the game he was in and he was not going to compound his position by reacting poorly in public. He was already thinking about the next move. Harry could see it. Harry was already thinking about the move after that. The session closed. The chamber began to empty. Harry stood from the petitioner's table as Brasscoin collected documents with efficient efficiency, and Sharpclaw said, very quietly, "Well done," which from a goblin of his generation and manner was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "We're not done," Harry said. "No," Sharpclaw agreed. "But this was done well." Augusta was there before Harry had finished the thought of looking for her. She had navigated the floor with the precision of someone who had been moving through this chamber for 30 years and knew every current and obstacle. She looked at Harry and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "Your parents would have been," and stopped again, the same place she'd stopped before, but this time the stopping was different. Less like she couldn't finish it. More like she didn't need to. "Thank you," Harry said. "For the Wizengamot vote and everything before it." "Don't thank me," she said, with a briskness that was slightly undermined by the fact that her eyes were bright. "Get upstairs. Neville has been sitting on his hands for 3 hours." Harry went upstairs to the gallery. Neville was there, and he looked at Harry with an expression that had so much in it, relief and exhilaration and the specific complicated joy of someone who has been fighting a quiet private battle for years and has just watched part of it become publicly real, that he clearly couldn't immediately organize it into words. "The compulsion count," he said finally. "Uncontested." "Uncontested," Harry confirmed. Neville exhaled, a long, specific exhale, the kind that carries something out with it. "Good," he said. He stopped. "Good." Lupin was 3 seats down, and he was on his feet, and he looked like he'd been through something and come out the other side of it still standing, which Harry thought was probably the best possible summary of Remus Lupin's relationship with most things. His eyes were red at the edges but his face was clear. "He's coming out," Harry said. Lupin nodded. His jaw was tight with an effort that Harry understood, 11 years of guilt and grief and believing something wrong and then discovering you'd been right and trying to hold that steady in your chest all at once. "I know." His voice was rough. "I know, he paused. "Is he all right? Do they know how the reports from Azkaban, will know more by tonight," Harry said. "I've already arranged for a medical assessment through Gringotts contacts, they have a healer who specializes in Dementor exposure." He paused. "It's not going to be easy." He's been there a long time. Lupin looked at him with that expression again, the one Harry still didn't have a word for, the warm and specific one. You arranged a healer. Of course, Harry said. You're 10. I know. Harry paused. Are you ready to see him? I've been ready for 11 years, Lupin said. I've also been terrified for 11 years. Both of those are true. Both of those are allowed, Harry said. Come on. He moved through the gallery toward the exit with Neville at his shoulder and Lupin a step behind, and the three of them were in the corridor when Thorn appeared from the opposite direction, moving fast, and stopped when he saw Harry. A word, Lord Potter, he said, with the professional courtesy of a man who had just had the most comprehensively losing session of his career and was maintaining his composure through what appeared to be very expensive training. Walk with me, Harry said, without slowing. Thorn fell into step, adjusting his pace. My client would like to request a private meeting. He understands that he's lost the civil case, Harry said, still walking. He understands the criminal referral is underway. He wants to make a personal case. He believes he can explain in ways that the documentation couldn't. Thorn was quiet for a moment. He believes there are things you need to know. About the prophecy. About the threat that still exists. Voldemort, Harry said, and Thorn flinched at the name in the way people who'd lived through that time still did, which Harry found worth noting. I know about the prophecy. I have the ministry copy from my parents' legal files. He paused. Tell Dumbledore that if he wants to talk about Voldemort, his first act should be addressing the question of where Voldemort currently is and what he's doing, with specifics, in writing, delivered to Gringotts. If the information is accurate and actionable, I'll meet with him. He paused at the corridor junction and looked at Thorn directly. If he comes to the meeting to manage me rather than to actually talk, I'll walk out. I know the difference. Thorn looked at him with the expression of a man revising several professional assumptions in real time. I'll convey that. Thank you. Harry turned the corner. The ministry atrium was busy with the post-session movement of people, Wisengamot members and their staff and various ministry officials and the journalists from the gallery, all processing the same event from 41 different angles. Harry moved through it with Neville and Lupin, and twice people stopped, looked, recognized him. The lightning bolt scar was visible, he'd stopped covering it, there was no practical reason to cover it anymore, and looked away again quickly, the specific quality of people updating something significant in their understanding. He heard his name twice in passing conversations. He kept walking. The Daily Prophet correspondent was near the atrium exit. Harry had expected this and had prepared for it. He wasn't going to manage the press narrative by avoiding it, he was going to manage it by choosing what he said. Lord Potter, the correspondent said, stepping forward with the ready quill of someone who'd been waiting for this. Helena Chambers, Daily Prophet. Can you comment on today's findings? Harry stopped. Briefly, he said. The Wisengamot found as the evidence required it to find. 4 counts sustained. 1 criminal referral. An innocent man is being released from Azkaban tonight, 11 years after an imprisonment that violated his legal rights. That's the story. He paused. The full findings are public record. I'd recommend reading them rather than summarizing them. Your response to the temporary suspension of, procedurally correct, Harry said. The provision is automatic. The question isn't whether it should have been applied. It was always going to be applied once the criminal referral was made. He paused. Anything else? Chambers looked slightly winded by the pace of his answers, which were not giving her the quotable outrage she'd been expecting. How do you feel about, I feel that the system worked today, Harry said. Which is not always guaranteed, so I'm noting it with appropriate gratitude. He looked at her directly. What happens next will depend on the criminal investigation and on whether the individuals involved choose cooperation over continued resistance. That's where your attention should be. He nodded. Good afternoon, Miss Chambers. He walked away. Lupin, 2 steps behind, said very quietly, "Your father would have given that reporter a quote that was twice as long and half as useful." "I know," Harry said. "I read the journal." He heard Neville make a quickly suppressed sound that was definitely a laugh. The safe house that evening was the fullest it had been since Harry moved in. Augusta came. Brasscoin came for an hour to go over post-hearing procedures and then left with the efficiency of a man who had other cases and had contributed what he'd come to contribute. Lovegood sent a brief fire message, literally, a piece of parchment that arrived through the fireplace burning at the edges and extinguished itself once it reached Harry's hand, that said only, "Magnificent. I'll be in touch." XL Neville stayed. He and Harry spent an hour at the kitchen table going over the criminal referral timeline and what it meant for the next phase, with Neville's procedural notes spread between them and both of them talking through it in the rapid shorthand of two people who had been doing this long enough to build a shared language. He stayed for dinner too, which the safe house's house elf produced with quiet efficiency, and it was the most ordinary evening Harry had had in recent memory, a proper meal, people around the table, the conversation ranging across the case and then away from it into other things. Neville describing his first attempt at wand work since the ritual removal with the expressive self-deprecation of someone finally comfortable enough to be funny about himself. Sirius arrived at 11 o'clock. Harry had known it was coming. The Gringotts healer had sent a fire message at 9 confirming transport was underway, but knowing and experiencing were different, and when the fireplace flared green and the healer came through first, followed by a man who was holding himself upright with the specific effort of someone whose body has forgotten what upright feels like, Harry understood all at once the full scale of what 11 years in Azkaban meant made into a person. Sirius Black was 33 years old and looked like a man twice that, not because of any physical infirmity but because of a quality of deep-seated exhaustion that wasn't sleep deprivation, it was the exhaustion of having had most of your better feelings systematically eaten for 11 years. He was thin, too thin, with long dark matted hair and hollow cheeks, and his eyes, when they adjusted to the light, were gray and very dark, the gray of deep water, and they moved across the room with the automatic wariness of someone who had been in a place where every unexpected thing was a threat. They found Harry. And stopped. The healer had said, in her earlier message, that extended Dementor exposure created specific deficits in emotional response, that the feelings that Dementors fed on, the good ones, were the most damaged, the most difficult to access. She had said to expect withdrawal and flatness and difficulty connecting. She had said to be patient. Sirius Black looked at Harry across the safe house living room, and the flatness shattered. Not dramatically, not the way it would happen in a story someone was exaggerating for effect. Simply and quietly and completely, like ice going out in spring, the flatness broke and underneath it was something that was very old and very present and had survived 11 years in Azkaban without being destroyed, only buried under everything the Dementors had piled on top of it. He crossed the room in 3 steps and put both hands on Harry's shoulders and looked at his face with the specific desperate attention of someone verifying that something real is actually there, and his hands were shaking. "Harry," he said. His voice was raw and destroyed and entirely certain. "Hi, Sirius," Harry said. Sirius made a sound that was not quite a word. His hands tightened on Harry's shoulders and then he pulled him into an embrace that had 11 years of impossible things in it, and Harry let it be what it needed to be, kept still and solid and present, because Sirius needed something real to hold on to right now and Harry was real. Lupin was across the room, and his face was doing something complicated and human and private that Harry wasn't going to look at directly, giving him the space of not being observed for a minute. Neville had gone very quiet in the corner, watching with the expression of someone witnessing something they don't want to interrupt and are glad to have seen. After a while Sirius pulled back and looked at Harry again, the same focused verification, and said, "You look like James." "I know," Harry said. "Also Lily. Everyone says both." Sirius laughed, and it was a cracked and damaged version of what a laugh was supposed to be, but it was real. "Lily would be furious about that," he said. "She always said you had her nose." "I do have her nose," Harry said. "I checked." Sirius laughed again, and this one was slightly less cracked. Lupin moved forward, and Sirius saw him, and whatever happened in Sirius's face when he saw Lupin was something Harry was going to remember for the rest of his life, the specific reunion of two people who had each believed the other was something he wasn't, who had each done their separate damage in the absence of the truth, who were now on the other side of all of it and finding out they were still here. Harry stepped back. He sat on the arm of the sofa near Neville, and they were both quiet together, watching Sirius and Lupin occupy the center of the room, and it was the right thing to be doing. "Is he going to be okay?" Neville asked, very quietly. "Yes," Harry said. "Not tonight. Not quickly. But yes." Neville nodded. He looked at the room, at Sirius, at Lupin, at the fireplace, at Harry. "You did this," he said. "All of this." "We did," Harry said. Neville looked at him, and the slightly hopeful expression that Harry had noticed in Fortescue's 7 weeks ago, the one that had asked if Harry was going to disappear, that expression was gone. Replaced by something more settled, more present. "What's next?" Neville asked. Harry looked at Sirius, who was sitting now, Lupin beside him, saying something to him in a low voice, and Sirius was listening with his whole self, with all of that grey-eyed attention. "Next," Harry said, "we find Peter Pettigrew." Outside the safe house windows, London moved on, and the wizarding world was reading the evening editions and revising its understanding of everything it thought it knew, and somewhere Dumbledore was in a room thinking about what came next, and Harry was in a room thinking about what came next, and between those two thoughts the shape of the future was being decided. Harry was not afraid of what came next. He never had been.